The old world in which people lived before was destroyed. In an instant, people had to fight monsters simply for survival. And the life of the white-haired youth was no exception. During all the time spent in the new world, he had already managed to get used to what was happening. And now the young man could face new battles with an unfazed expression. This happened day after day, for many months. In the first month, he had to face a huge horned monster in battle. And after a year, he had seen so many strange creatures that he stopped being surprised. So, in endless battles and struggle for survival, 10 whole years passed. With just his sword, the young man could cut down any monster. In truth, he knew no fear. Thus, he reached the strongest of all monsters. The dominant monster looked at the young man with pity and gave him a chance to surrender as his world was destroyed. But the young knight had no intention of giving up, at least not now, when he was face to face with the cause of his suffering. The monster said that the guy was simply wasting his talent and offered him to become his sword. But the young man was extremely aggressive and hissed at the monster not to make fun of him. The next moment, he rushed into the attack, using all the anger that had accumulated in him over the past 10 years. The guy swung his weapon at the monster and was ready to kill him. But the monster dodged, its eyes glowing red with undisguised anger. The next moment, the boy realized the monster wasn't dodging. In fact, it was trying to grab the hero, but it didn't have the time. The Demon King looked at the hero with pity and tensed up. The hero, meanwhile, was preparing for a new attack on his enemy. But suddenly, something changed. And this change made the hero surprised and begin to retreat. The Demon King attacked again, and again he missed. He said that no matter how the hero wriggled, for him he was nothing more than a worm. The attack hit the hero, causing him to fly back and gasp in pain. He flew backwards for several meters, but managed to land on his feet and not fall. He charged forward with renewed vigor to attack the huge monster, trying to find its weak spot. But the monster's entire appearance inspired fear. He looked invincible and very vicious. He had no trouble parrying the hero's second attack. The monster was beginning to lose interest in this fight. The young man sank to the ground again. This time, getting up was a little more difficult, as the wounds were more painful. During all this time, the monster never even used his weapon. That's how skeptical he was of the young knight. Looking up, the knight noticed something around the monster's neck, a pendant with a glittering blue stone. At that moment, he was struck by the idea that this could be the Demon King's weak point. This time, when the monster swung at the knight, he didn't wait long, but immediately rushed into battle himself. He drew his sword and with a mad glint in his eyes, charged. Not at the monster, but at its amulet. The hero's sword cut through the air. He moved forward at breakneck speed to avoid the monster's attack. The moment the monster raised his sword over the hero, his fate was already decided. The sword's blade didn't touch the knight as originally planned. Strangely, the knight was still alive. Then the monster realized that his amulet, the one that gave him power, was forever destroyed. He gritted his teeth at the realization, and his eyes turned even redder, cursing the boy. The knight had expended a great deal of energy during this battle. Now he could barely stand on his feet. The broken amulet emitted a beautiful blue glow, which was especially noticeable in the darkness. The monster began to fade away, screaming hysterically and cursing everything at once until it vanished into thin air. A huge, seemingly invincible monster simply vanished into oblivion. The fair-haired youth had been badly hurt during the fight. Now he was finally able to lie down on the ground. His clothes were soaked in blood, but it was worth it. His efforts had not been in vain. At that moment, the knight tried to find the strength to keep his eyes open. His eyelids were heavy, and he was staring up at something. Above him was a beautiful, starry sky. Somewhere out there, in the middle of space, a comet was flying past. And on the ground, instead of a beautiful view, everything was burning with uncontrollable flames. Someone in black flip-flops was moving slowly through the city. This young man looked very focused, as if he was going to carry out some important task. His hair was jet black and his eyes glowed red. In the place where he wanted to go, there was a siren light hanging on the fence, flashing red. This place was the Namsan Gate. The alarm's mechanical voice asked for the license plate number to be scanned. Unregistered heroes and civilians were asked to refrain from entering. This place was in the Yongsan district of Seoul. The young man stood before the gate, lost in thought. The next moment, as if nothing had happened, he jumped over the fence to the other side. All the gates immediately began to close automatically, raising dust. There was a commotion, and the mechanical voice of a siren sounded the alarm and that an unregistered hero had entered through the gate. The young man quickly glanced around to get an idea of where he was. He ran to a patch of forest beyond the gate. Now that the alarm had been raised, he had to avoid being caught. So he walked forward, calmly, as if he knew what he was doing. Less than 2 minutes had passed when someone's interested voice called out to him. This made the young man stop. A group of 4 people in uniform called out to the guy, asking if he was lost. One of them said he didn't know what had happened to him, but he could go with them. The young man realized that the notice of the intrusion must not have reached these people yet. Meanwhile, the group members began to discuss the fact that this guy was dressed too strangely to be a hero. They said that in their time, porters dressed more casually, but the young man's outfit was still a bit odd. They also made a couple of comments about his backpack, not noticing how the guy turned in the other direction. They thought that this young man was one of those stupid porters who had been abandoned by the heroes with whom they had arrived. At that moment, the young man finally spoke. He said he understood what they were trying to say, but he just came in. A member of that group immediately started screaming that the guy had definitely been screwed. The leader of the squad said that he had seen many people like this guy, and he understood what he was thinking when he passed through the gate. But searching for the gate just for fun was foolish. First, he needed to obtain a hero's certificate. The young man said he understood that the man was trying to help him, but he didn't feel particularly grateful. After this statement, the whole group stared at him as if he were crazy. The young man turned around and went his way, and the 4 people continued shouting among themselves. But the gang leader was neutral about it. He said that if someone was so careless, they would only learn from experience. He also said the gates were nothing like what people see on TV. But at that moment, something changed. A huge green monster, looking threatening, suddenly appeared next to the young man. The monster's eyes glowed with malice, as if he had found his prey after several months. He laughed at how easy it would be to kill this young man. The guy deftly took his backpack off his back and was ready to join the fight at any moment. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, as if he had been waiting for this moment for a long time and wanted to enjoy it. The next second, the monster began to attack. He raised his weapon to strike, but the young man dodged. His brown eyes shone. He said something about 10 whole years having passed. This opponent's sword seemed extremely sharp. It looked heavy and threatening. But when the weapon missed its target, the monster became confused and stared at its enemy. All this only to realize that this young man was already attacking him from the side, swinging his fist. He punched the monster without even using any weapon, which was quite strange. And with one blow, he knocked the monster's head off. Now this enormous creature will never give anyone trouble again. The young man landed on the ground next to the body of the monster he had slain. His movement seemed extremely precise. His hand was bloody, but he didn't care. All he could think about was that it really didn't make any difference. Rising to his feet, the boy began searching for something with his eyes, as if he had forgotten something. Then, noticing something, he reached out his hand, trying to pick it up. The next moment, a weapon appeared in his hand. This blade wasn't exactly good, but it wasn't bad either. The young man looked at the weapon with a strange look, trying to assess its value. And then he pointed the blade toward the body of the monster he had just killed. He wanted to find something there. The next moment, blood gushed from the body of the monster, which had died only recently. The young man dug into the huge wound with the newly acquired blade, desperately trying to get something out. After several dozen seconds of effort, something resembling a drop appeared in his hand. It was one of the low-level magic stones. Previously, they were so insignificant that he wouldn't even have looked at them. But now, everything has changed, and the young man put even such an insignificant thing in his backpack. He continued to rummage through his backpack for some time, trying to properly rearrange all the things stored there. Then the boy heard strange sounds coming from the nearby thickets. Something was definitely hiding there. And, as if reading thoughts, several pairs of legs of those monsters who were preparing an ambush immediately appeared from there. They all rushed at the young man, ready to cut off his head at any moment for having just killed one of their comrades. But the guy continued to look at this whole pile with an inscrutable expression on his face, as if he didn't care about anyone or anything. The next moment, he pulled back his hand, which until that moment had been clutching something. The young man held that same low-level magic crystal in his hand, and now he was ready to attack his opponents with it. Sensing something was wrong, one of the attackers rushed to retreat, while the second looked at the young man in shock. A few moments later, another headless monster fell to the ground. His tribesmen, apparently determined to avenge their brother, drew their blades and advanced toward the young man. He had expected this outcome and so wasn't surprised at all. On the contrary, he had hoped for it. The group of heroes he had met earlier was still making their way through the trees. The red-haired girl started talking about that annoying guy they met earlier. She was a little concerned and asked what if he really had died. Her teammate asked if she was worried about him. The man, who had previously acted as the team leader, interrupted the conversation between two people. He said that if this guy was an outsider, the agents from the control center would have been here by now. This location was the gate to Namsan, a C rank. Therefore, elite agents of B rank or higher will be deployed. Having summed up what was said, the man added that if that guy did not recklessly rush at the monsters, he would not die. They talked about how that guy was probably shaking with fear and waiting for the agents, but in reality, it was the monsters who were shaking with fear. The young man was just dealing with another monster, cutting off its head. This was already the third monster that dared to attack this boy and said goodbye to life. The monsters' swords fell to the ground one after another as their souls gradually left their bodies. One of the remaining surviving monsters suddenly noticed the new change of stop, but it was too late to turn around. The same young man was attacking him from behind. He was swinging his leg and preparing his fist for a second attack. Needless to say, a second attack wasn't necessary. After the kick, the monster coughed up a substantial amount of blood. That's how all those unfortunate attackers fell. These monsters were once feared, and now someone dealt with them like this. The young man dragged along another blade taken from the monster and was going to cut up their bodies again in order to get the stones. He swung his arm and with a glint in his eye said there would be 3 more magic stones. This couldn't help but please him. It was a hot summer day outside. There were few clouds on the horizon and the sun was shining brightly. The boy's black backpack currently contained a few low-ranking magic stones, but that was fine with him for now. The harvest was meager. He collected only 12 low-grade stones and 6 medium-grade ones. Coming out of his reverie, the boy realized an agent had been chasing him for some time. This wasn't good. But he didn't have time to go too far because the next moment the sound of several pairs of feet was heard. Behind him, 4 agents appeared. All were dressed in black suits and all were wearing dark glasses. Their leader announced that they had arrived from the gate control center and asked to provide a hero's ID or to accompany them to the center. The young man looked at the agents as if they were a bunch of brainless creatures and asked about the cost control center. The second agent joined the conversation. Not wanting to answer any questions, he asked to cooperate with them and follow instructions. The young man who had just been caught by the agents was clearly not happy with this situation and wanted to get rid of them as soon as possible. He turned around and was about to quickly retreat, saying what a hassle it was. The agents once again asked him to do what he was told and also began frantically and quickly taking out handcuffs. They said that if he refused to follow their orders, they would be obliged to use force against him. The next second, the agent's pale hand grabbed the young man, not allowing him to take a single step. Although the agents looked scared, They still recited the memorized script about how the young man would be better off going with them downtown. But the boy took control of the situation, threatening to break the arm of one of the agents. The white-haired agent certainly didn't expect this. His eyes widened in surprise, and the pain inflicted on his arm. The young man looked at him with a look full of hatred and asked him to leave him alone and not interfere in his affairs. The other agents, who also looked strange, took out all their weapons and were ready to attack at any moment. Their weapons looked like strange iron poles. It was quite impressive. These staves were fourth-class magical weapons. They might work on common orcs, but nothing more. Noticing that they were preparing to attack him, the young man broke the unfortunate agent's arm. He said this was his final warning. His words sounded quite impressive, and his actions backed it up. The young man ordered the agents to get out of his sight immediately, lest they suffer even more. After all, their weapons weren't valuable enough to warrant killing them. The brunette leaned back sharply, barely tensing his arms. He was already prepared for a massacre with the control center agents. When the men pounced on him, the hero didn't even move. He seemed to deflect their blows with light touches. When one of the employees tried to knock him out, the brunette easily dodged the oncoming blow. And then, just a moment later, the brunette suddenly jumped forward, crushing the green grass under his feet. One of the officers tried to take advantage of this by following him, but the brunette kicked the man in the stomach. Blood began to flow from the center employee's mouth. His colleague across from him froze for a second in surprise, looking at the boy. But a moment later, that colleague too was lying on the ground. The brunette knocked him off with a single blow to the stomach. But there was still one gate control center employee behind them. He froze in surprise, clutching his sword tighter. His face was profusely sweating from fear and fatigue. He bowed his head angrily, sighing heavily. But the brunette looked quite indifferent as he examined the face of his last enemy. He merely shook his head slightly. But just a moment later, the image of the boy in the eyes of the center employee seemed to begin to blur. The man shook his head, unable to comprehend where his enemy could have disappeared to. It seemed as if the officer was frozen in fear, but the brunette appeared right behind him. Swinging his arm, the hero struck the employee in the stomach, knocking him back. The control center employee dropped to one knee, trying to recover from the powerful impact. The middle-aged man looked at the young boy in bewilderment. He rose from his knees, clutching his chest. Brunette asked if there were any remaining problems. He replied that as long as the law wasn't being broken, there was no point in sending agents. But suddenly, the brunette asked about information about the rift. The employee looked up at the boy in surprise. This is a passage into a world that gives birth to monsters. The new energy resource is stones obtained from monster hunts. Therefore, the gates are under state control. And this space, which could not be closed, was called the Rift. The brunette said that they all didn't care which gate he went through because the center's employees would still be looking for him. The boy insisted that it would be easier for the gate control center to accuse him of trespassing or something else. The employee replied that if an unregistered hero enters the gate, agents are dispatched immediately. The agent exclaimed that the rift was harder to penetrate than the gate. He also added that the Hero Association would likely intervene. But the brunette, with a flash of yellow eyes, replied that he didn't care. He'd simply decided to walk past the agent. The agent knew he should have immediately notified headquarters about this madman. But then, the brunette suddenly grabbed the agent's face. Then the brunette hit the man with all his might, knocking him back. The agent's eyes widened in fear and pain. With one sharp movement, the brunette with yellow eyes threw the agent away from him. He flew into a nearby tree. Then the brunette sighed heavily, looking at the employee's body behind him. He thought that there was nothing special about it. But the agent shouted at the boy that he was just a common bastard. The brunette had already turned and hurried away. The center employee shouted that next time he'd definitely come after that bastard. Brunette, however, ignored him. A strange image suddenly appeared before my eyes. It seemed as if fragile crystals were falling from the ceiling. The man screamed loudly and shrilly. He refused to accept his fate as he fell into the depths. The blonde thought about the death scream that had pierced his ears. He recalled the feeling of being pulled somewhere. Now, floating in the void, the blonde understood that, in the usual sense, this had always been considered death. The blonde closed his eyes, as if submissively awaiting his future fate in the new world. But, as if sensing the change, the blonde man with golden hair opened his eyes. They were bright blue. Now the blue-eyed blonde found himself in heaven. Part of his clothes were torn and his body was hanging upside down. The blonde man asked who was standing in front of him. It was a young boy with dark hair and yellow eyes. The boy immediately replied, confused, that his name was Seo Do-jun. He awkwardly said that he was dying. Seo Do-jun, placing his hand on his chest, quietly swore that he would disappear quietly if the blonde listened to his request. But the blonde suddenly interrupted him. He abruptly refused the dying man, casting an indifferent glance at Jun. Then Seo Do-jun immediately lowered his gaze, sighing heavily. It was as if he had decided that from now on, everything was useless. Suddenly looking away from his blue eyes, the blonde said that he did not regret his life at all. The hero said that after 10 years of fighting, his friend turned traitor, the country was destroyed, and his family and comrades died. Recalling the outline of the castle, the man said that he wanted to live a bright life. But now, it seems like nothing. And the blonde suddenly said that Seo Do-jun knew this feeling too. The boy awkwardly looked away. Jun lowered his head and said that this was how he lived, but his grandmother, or Eun-young, should not have to go through this. The blonde just sighed tiredly and shook his head, irritably asking what the boy in front of him meant. The blue-eyed hero asked Seo Do-jun what he wanted. He couldn't help but smile brightly and sincerely in response. And then, placing his hand on his heart, Seo Do-jun told the hero about his sincere dreams and desires. Then, after some time, the Seoul Gasan Digital Complex, Gumyahan District, appeared before the eyes of that hero. The building is now known as the Hero Complex, and the turnover of magic stones from the gates exceeds the turnover of IT companies. Seo Do-jun walked past the crowd of people, heading to only one specific place in the complex. After a while, bright signs appeared before the hero's eyes. He immediately wondered if he should really go there. As Seo Do-jun walked inside, he saw a guy. He greeted him cheerfully, still staring at his phone. Jun said he wanted to sell the magic stones. The seller exclaimed that they offered the best prices in all of Korea. And then the brunette immediately, with sharp and careless movements, took out several bright red stones from his backpack. The seller, however, felt disgusted. He mentally condemned Seo Do-jun for not wiping the blood off the stones before selling them. The salesman said that while he sorted out the goods, Seo Do-jun could drink coffee. After a while, the seller had to carefully wipe the blood off all the stones, while Jun enjoyed his coffee. The seller began listing the grades of stones and their quantities, saying that the commission would be 40% of the price. The man smiled brightly, saying that for all the stones, Jun would receive 5,460,000 won. Jun walked closer to the seller and said that he did all the work himself, so for another 40% commission. The seller smiled and replied that the commission was usually 45%, but theirs was only 40%. The seller said the brunette could take the stones, but he reminded him that no one would offer Seo Do-jun a higher price. But when the brunette began to collect his stones, the seller suddenly hit him on the hand, not allowing him to move. The seller said Seo Do-jun would have to pay for the appraisal of the stones and a cup of coffee. He quoted 40,000 won. The seller also said that the blood on the stones had ruined the towel. Seo Do-jun sighed, saying he had no money. The shopkeeper chuckled, saying that their store was being watched over by C-rank heroes, so Jun wouldn't be able to just leave. Then, several men emerged from the room behind the salesman. They were of impressive height and had a strong build. The hero with the scar on his face asked if the seller had any problems, and what the reason for calling them was. And then the brunette immediately turned around, carefully examining the face of his enemy. The scarred man looked at the boy below him in bewilderment. His mouth barely opened in surprise as he stared at Seo Do-jun. The salesman hid behind the counter, his body trembling slightly and sweat breaking out on his face. Then one of the heroes cried out loudly, falling on the salesman. The latter tried to protect himself with his hands. The brunette knocked out the C-rank hero with one blow. Now he lay unconscious on the table. And next to him lay two more of the same heroes. Sodo-jun sighed with his hand and turned around. The salesman hid under the table. And then the man walked closer to the only person who remained conscious. Sodo-jun leaned on the broken table and then said that the commission should only be 1%. Sodo-jun's eyes sparkled brightly as he said that from this day on, they would only make profitable deals. The salesman said he'd be waiting for Sodo-jun again, and the store's sign was already before his eyes. Then, after a while, Sodo-jun threw a small wad of money, secured with a rubber band, onto the table. The grandmother and her granddaughter were very surprised, their eyes wide with amazement. They clearly hadn't expected to see such a sum of money. Carefully taking the bills in her hands, the granny asked in bewilderment where Sodo-jun got such a large amount of money. Sodo-jun replied that he once lent money to a friend who wanted to start a business, and his business became very profitable. Sodo-jun's grandmother still didn't fully believe her grandson. She asked if Sodo-jun really had such friends. Then the brunette smiled softly and awkwardly, saying that he had communicated with that friend where he grew up. Then Grandma's questions immediately disappeared. She simply looked down at the stack of money in her hands. But Sodo-jun's sister just smiled brightly and asked if they would really become rich now. The brunette smiled brightly in response and scratched his sister's head. He said that they were truly rich now. Sodo-jun's sister began to happily run and jump around the room, saying that they were now rich. Sodo-jun watched his sister with a certain pity and sympathy. She was smiling brightly and laughing. The real Sodo-jun came to his mind, asking him to take care of his grandmother in Eunyoung. The brunette asked for his loved ones to live in a safe house. After these words, Jun immediately disappeared, not giving the blonde a chance to respond. Finally, Sodo-jun's sister placed her arms over her brother's shoulders. He turned away, looking at himself in the mirror. He remembered that when he woke up, he had already become the new Sodo-jun. Jun thought about the fact that the safest house in Korea currently costs 110 billion won. The brunette understood that he was not obligated to fulfill a one-sided promise. But if he could get his power back, the money would become nothing. Sodo-jun knew that the rifts, gates, and monsters in this world were much weaker than those in his fallen world. He, as the god of the sword, recalled the horrors of his world, realizing that now for him it was just a child's play. The boy looked down, knowing that he still hadn't recovered even a tenth of his strength. Suddenly, there was a knock on Sodo-jun's door and loud calls for him. Grandma and Eunyoung tensed at the sound. Sodo-jun smiled brightly and said he would go check on him. His sister froze. As he approached the front door, the man slowly opened it, stepping out of his apartment. There were two men standing in front of him. They were both quite strong, but Sodo-jun didn't care. The men told Sodo-jun that he needed to learn to repay his debts. It turned out that the boy's debt amounted to 48 million won. Jun exhaled, realizing that the real Jun had borrowed 5 million won from them before his death for his grandmother's treatment. The men said that Sodo-jun had earned money from the gate, so it was time to pay off the debt. The blonde smiled brightly, asking not to be surprised. But Sodo-jun immediately struck him with all his might. Then Sodo-jun hit the second creditor, who immediately fell to the cold floor behind him. The blonde froze in surprise, clearly not expecting such skills from the simple boy in front of him. The creditor turned to his friend in fear, exclaiming loudly. Sodo-jun froze in place. Jun reminded that he had already paid more than 9 million won, so it was he who should demand the money back. The creditor immediately recoiled from the man in fear, asking if it was really Sodo-jun in front of him. The brunette swung again, asking to convey to the god of creditors that he would definitely come to them soon. And then it seemed as if even the tower had rocked under the force of the man's blow. A loud scream rang out. After some time, a fairly large shopping center appeared before the hero's eyes, in which there were many people. The man's gaze fell on a large shelf displaying a variety of teddy bears. They seemed to glow. Eunyoung, as if enchanted, asked if she was sure she could have the new doll. Her eyes sparkled brightly. So Do-jun said that they had already bought clothes, so now Eun-young can take absolutely whatever she wants. He thought that as he delved deeper into Seo Do-jun's memories, his own faded emotions began to return to him. He smiled brightly as he watched Eun-young happily examine the dolls. She sat down in front of the shelf. He thought that for now, only empathy had returned to him, because June had always been kind to his half-sister. Then the guy turned away with a smile, thinking that now he would protect this feeling. The girl picked up a small rabbit and asked her brother if he could buy her this doll. Then, Seo Do-jun began to look at the small and sad rabbit that Eun-young was holding tightly in her arms. And then Seo Do-jun gave his sister the big teddy bear that she had been looking at on the shelves for so long. So Do-jun smiled brightly, reminding himself that he'd told his sister to take anything. He gripped the toy's head tightly. In response, Eun-young smiled even brighter, awkwardly scratching her neck. She laughed loudly, looking at her brother. Then the brother and sister saw 2 trays of different foods. After shopping, they wanted a snack. Seo Do-jun decided to get something healthier and more filling, but Eun-young got a burger and fries. But suddenly, Seo Do-jun was called by several guys behind him. He turned around with interest. Behind the brunette stood a middle-aged woman, flanked by 2 bodyguards. They were all looking at Seo Do-jun. The blonde said that Seo Do-jun looked like a loser in that outfit. She also asked who was sitting next to him. The woman suggested that Seo Do-jun had screwed up and gotten someone pregnant, just like what happened to his mother. Hearing this, Seo Do-jun, naturally, immediately lost his temper. He began breathing heavily, looking at the blonde's face. And Eun-young just looked at the faces of her new acquaintances in surprise. She didn't understand who this strange woman was. Seo Do-jun considered what he should do in this situation. He looked gloomy. The woman who was just about to insult him was a little surprised by such a reaction to her words, but continued to look with a smirk. At this time, Do-jun's sister was calmly eating her burger and looking at her brother. The scary woman turned to Do-jun's sister and asked her name, to which the girl introduced herself as Lee Eun-young. The woman immediately began to say disapprovingly that the girl was dressed strangely and that she was exactly like her mother. She then turned to Do-jun and asked if her judgment was correct, her face still wearing a disapproving expression. The guy gritted his teeth, trying to resist the urge to hit this tactless woman. She asked him why he had suddenly gone quiet. Still waiting for no answer, the woman grimaced even more. She stared silently at Do-jun, who still hadn't said anything. Then her expression surpassed all the scary grimaces from horror movies, and she turned to her sister Do-jun again. The girl asked the girl if she knew what the word slut meant. It was a rather odd question to ask a child. At that moment, something flashed in Do-jun's eyes. He couldn't bear this woman's bullying any longer. A rough and shrill male voice was heard saying that this girl was as ugly as an orc. The annoying woman turned towards Do-jun with a look of complete incomprehension of what was happening on her face. Do-jun was so angry that the veins on his face stood out. He hadn't intended to harm this woman in the first place. Seo Do-jun was born out of wedlock and lived in poverty. His mother died when he was 7 years old, and his father reluctantly accepted him into his new family. The boy lived for 10 years, enduring neglect and insults. After his stepmother gave birth to a son, Do-jun was made to understand that he was superfluous, and they kicked him out successfully. He was thus forced to move in with his maternal grandmother and his sister. These people became, for a time, the thing in his life that kept him trying. How did Do-jun's tormented heart endure all this? But now, everything will be different, because the former hero has decided to take control of Do-jun's life. Do-jun stood up and said that even though they had lived together with this woman for 12 years, she remained just as disgusting. He told her everything he thought about her brick face, and how stupid she was. The woman's bodyguards didn't understand what they were supposed to do in this situation, because Do-jun had never been like this before. Do-jun also said that she was simply jealous of everyone who was kinder and more beautiful, and that she had no reason to look down on this girl. When he spoke about this girl, he meant his sister, who took care of him. At that moment, his expression looked quite confident. This was clearly not natural for the old Dojun. After these words, the woman again made a strange grimace and asked him to repeat what the boy had just said. Suddenly, a beautifully dressed woman appeared from somewhere. She greeted Dojun, but her face still held a certain coldness. This woman was the mother of the very same mentally disabled woman who had just dared to insult Dojun's sister. The girl cried into her mother's shoulder, complaining about Dojun, but her mother did not support her. The woman looked very irritated by the way her daughter was behaving. She asked her daughter how she could behave so uncivilly. Then the woman smiled at Dojun and spoke to him. She asked how he was doing. This woman had tormented June for 12 years, and now, as if nothing had happened, she told him that he could at least come home sometimes. She said, with the same smile, that her father was very worried about him. But her speech was interrupted by Dojun's voice. He said that he and this woman were nobodies to each other, and he was not in the mood to chat about personal matters with strangers. And then, with a strange expression on his face that evoked fear, he asked the woman to get lost. Her face immediately darkened beyond recognition. But everything he said was sincere, so she should leave quickly. After weighing the pros and cons, she simply turned silently and walked away. Her daughter looked confused, but followed her mother. The woman couldn't believe that this young man was the Seo Dojun she knew before. The woman's daughter finally started running after her. The two were immediately followed by bodyguards. So Dojun looked confident. He was glad he had finally stood up to these women. His sister, however, was surprised. Seo Dojun, who would not say a word in response and would meekly endure all insults, no longer existed. The young man thought that it would be much better if the evil stepmother realized this simple truth sooner. Meanwhile, dusk had fallen over the city, and that terrible woman and her daughter were riding in the car. Her daughter kept asking her mother why she didn't do anything to Seo-Dojun, why she didn't crush him like an idiot. She complained so fervently about how he had somehow insulted her that it was painful to watch. But the woman ignored her daughter's reaction. She asked Lee's manager why Seo-Dojun was still alive. Manager Lee replied that he had been informed that Dojun had been escorted outside the gate and left there. Now the girl finally lost her temper. She screamed about how the idiot who should have died was somehow still breathing. Manager Lee promised to find out what was wrong. The woman's daughter, confused, asked what she meant by should die. Seo-Dojun's stepmother looked ahead meaningfully and had no intention of answering her daughter's question. But her daughter didn't let up. She kept asking what exactly her mother meant. This girl couldn't understand why her mother was going to kill Dojun, or if she was going to kill him at all. Then her daughter had a sudden realization. She wondered if her mother really still liked someone. But then the girl corrected herself, convincing herself that everything was not like that at all. Because if her grandfather or father found out about this, it would be bad. In the middle of this monologue, the girl's mouth was shut by her own mother. She didn't want to listen to her daughter's nonsense any longer. The woman looked at her daughter with anger in her eyes and said that no matter what happened, Mom would sort it out. Her mother asked her to mind her own business. Tears of fear began to gather in the girl's eyes. The car sped along the dark streets. The girls sitting inside were thinking about their own things. The evil stepmother thought that she had to get rid of the little brat by any means necessary, no matter what the cost. 10 years ago, fault zones appeared. These zones were closed, but over time, monsters began to emerge from them and kill people. Due to the rift zones, the world was plunged into absolute chaos, where there was no longer any light. But with the appearance of heroes, this new world was brought under control relatively quickly. People also learned to obtain magic stones from monsters. When magic stones became a new source of energy, countries around the world cooperated to turn rifts into gates. Now the entire industry revolved around gates and heroes. In other words, to make money, you had to be a hero. Seo-Dojun got out of the taxi, wondering what he should do next. He found himself in front of the HCS building in the capital, Yeongdeung. The building was quite old, and the windows were covered with advertisements. The guy slowly walked into the building, thinking about what might await him inside. Still, this Seo Do-jun wasn't well acquainted with the workings of this world, even though he had all the memories. The building was filled with the smell of cigarette smoke, and a man was sitting in the middle of the room smoking. There were two men standing behind him. None of them looked friendly. The man put out his cigarette on the table and complained that Do-jun had beaten up his guys and now had come here. Do-jun sat down on a chair and said that, no matter how you look at it, their impudence surprised him. He didn't let the men say a word and continued to talk about how he was entitled to compensation for moral and physical damage. In his opinion, this boy had been through the gate and had experienced awakening. The company's CEO said that he was, therefore, a week shy of being awake and already getting all cocky. He offered to show him an example of what happens to someone who wakes up and immediately gets cocky. Three men, similar to the bodyguards of this company head, immediately burst into the meeting room. There were too many hostile men in the room now. The current Do-jun could handle even that. The head of the company again spoke about how there were some arrogant people who only awakened at D rank. And according to him, his guys could easily show particularly spirited D ranks where the crayfish spend the winter. But Do-jun wasn't at all afraid for his life. He still remained calm. In a calm, deep, and at the same time terrifying voice, he ordered the owner of the company to sit down. So Do-jun looked at the company owner and added his own phrase about what he hadn't finished saying yet. One of the bodyguards immediately attacked him because Do-jun dared to address the manager so familiarly. But the next moment, the man's entire fighting spirit was shattered as someone pulled his glasses. Then came the blow. All the other bodyguards stared at Seo Do-jun with complete bewilderment in their eyes. The young man threw the bodyguard back several meters with one blow and without any extra effort. Then the next bodyguard came under attack. Do-jun asked them if they were really involved in anything other than loan sharking. Then he attacked the third and said that he knew that this office also falsified documents. Now he really needed a hero certificate in order to earn money almost legally. The fourth bodyguard expressed a desire to attack Do-jun, but his attempt was also not particularly successful. Do-jun dodged his attack and attacked faster himself. These bodyguards were too insignificant. Just like that, after a few seconds, Seo Do-jun scattered the four bodyguards to different corners of the room. He ordered these people to immediately make him a perfect document so that he would not have any problems in the future. The young man set the next day as the deadline. The owner of the office widened his eyes at the deadline. The two bodyguards were also shocked. They hadn't expected this young man to simply scatter them, nor had they expected him to demand such a thing. The owner of this place tried to estimate Jun's strength. He didn't understand what kind of strength it was. This man couldn't be lower than rank B. Do-jun immediately demanded an answer to his request, to which the moneylender bowed his head with respect and promised to fulfill everything. Then Do-jun touched the poor man's whips and wanted to tell him something else. Do-jun looked at the man and asked if Hong Hee-ju had given him instructions to kill him. The man immediately remembered how Do-jun's stepmother had come to him the other day with her strange request. So Do-jun squeezed his hands around the frightened man's neck and demanded an answer as soon as possible. Just then, one of the bodyguards, who had been in different corners of the room a few minutes ago, came to his senses. But these bodyguards weren't about to attack. They all started talking about something Hong Hee-ju had said. The loan shark said that Hong Hee-ju wanted them to drive Do-jun into debt. The man asked Seo Do-jun to let him go because he still wanted to live. Then the young man let go and threw the moneylender back and asked if it was he who had locked him in the gate. The man tried to deny it. He looked scared. He swore it wasn't him and that he wasn't lying. He folded his hands in a prayerful gesture and said that he would not lock him in the gates as it was not beneficial for him. Do-jun thought for a few seconds, but he had no ideas yet. He didn't know who could have locked him in. Then he remembered something. The young man said the name Kang Chol-woo. This name was completely unfamiliar to him, but Seo Do-jun knew that this Kang was the man who had brought him and locked him in the gate, so he asked for information about him. Then the young man turned and walked out of the building, leaving these unfortunates to deal with all his errands until the next day. Leaving the establishment, Sodojun looked up at the sky. Today was another bright day. He recalled fragments of that conversation with the real Sodojun. He remembered Dojun asking him to protect his grandmother and Eun-young. Now, the seasoned hero vowed that while he was here, he would sort everything out. Perhaps out of pity, or perhaps out of mercy. The man held a gold card with his photograph attached to it. Then, Sodojun slowly placed the card on the small device. It immediately began to sparkle with a blue light. An automated voice was heard, stating that the hero's registration card had been accepted, but his level was below the recommended level. After hearing the warning, Sodojun swore softly. He said the dealer should have upgraded him to A rank. Sodojun hurried through the open door. The automated voice warned of danger again. The man entered the gates of the Night Island. The tunnel itself was considered B rank, and the size was D. June understood that solo playthrough was difficult due to the size of the gate, making it difficult to get rid of non-A rank monsters. The man looked up, hoping that luck would be on his side this time. Then he chuckled, realizing that otherwise he would have to face hundreds of monsters in a dark and narrow tunnel. A moment later, a huge, fanged snake appeared before him. Sodojun recoiled, avoiding the monster's claws. Sodojun's eyes widened, and he crossed his arms, preparing to attack. He whispered that he really liked this. The snake tried to kill the guest with its tongue as it advanced on him. A moment later, it launched a direct attack. But then the monster decided to unleash its venom. It opened its mouth wide, and its eyes glowed brightly. Sodojun understood that the black, deadly viper's venom could cause paralysis even with the slightest touch. The man then decided to kneel down, momentarily shielding his head from the snake's impending strike. But just a second later, Sodojun pushed off the ground with all his might, swinging for another attack. And then the brunette finally delivered the decisive blow to the black viper, knocking its body back. The snake howled loudly. Then Sodojun rushed away, avoiding the green drops of poison falling on his body. The brunette was wearing gloves, but some of the poison did spill onto them. The droplets immediately burned through the fabric. Sodojun said that for 300,000 won, these gloves weren't that bad. But then the brunette turned sharply, as if expecting another blow from the enemy. His yellow eyes flashed brightly. Behind him were now 4 black vipers who were trying to kill and devour Sodojun. With just one blow, the man managed to defeat one of the vipers. It fell to the ground, nearly choking on its own blood. Moments later, Sodojun dealt with the other monsters in the tunnel in the same way. Green poison sprayed from one of the creature's mouth again, the drops heading toward a man nearby. And Sodojun managed to avoid the monster's attack again. But for a second, the man froze in place. Having dealt with the monsters, June decided to search for the stones in their bodies. But, as it turned out, none of them had any stones. He decided that everything here was the same as in the previous world, and the chance of the viper containing a stone was 3%. Sodojun walked past the snake's corpse, knowing he would have to catch hundreds more monsters. Moving further, Sodojun noticed several decomposed skeletons, and next to them, the remains of weapons. A strange black haze hovered around one of the skeletons, passing through the skull of a long-dead hero. Slowly raising his eyes, Sodojun asked if the monster in front of him was the boss. The enormous serpent had already leaned toward him, examining the new arrival with interest. Its eyes glittered in the darkness. Sodojun threw his backpack off his back, saying that he was already lost anyway, but it was for the best. Sodojun leaped high into the air, striking the monster in the face. He shouted that he had to finish this quickly, but the brunette couldn't land even a single blow on the monster. For a second, June was stunned with surprise. Looking at the imprint of his hand on the wall, Sodojun realized that his attack hadn't worked. Sodojun was stuck in one of the tunnel's rocks. His eyes widened as he struggled to get out of the trap. A second later, another loud blow rang out. The snake, with one sharp jerk, reached Sodojun. Then the brunette found himself pressed tightly against the wall. Sodojun lowered his head in pain, trying to catch his breath. The boss opened his mouth wide, preparing to destroy the enemy. But Seo-do-jun quickly recovered at that moment. Literally at the last second, the man jumped away from the snake that was about to devour Seo-do-jun. The man tried to cling to the floor in order to stay on his feet in case of an attack by a black viper. Then, just a moment later, Seo-do-jun lunged forward with all his might, swinging his arm for another attack. Seo-do-jun struck the black viper again, trying to put all his strength into his strike. Then the brunette began to slowly watch the snake, moving away from the monster to a safe distance. Seo-do-jun realized that this monster was on a different level than the vipers he had already defeated. The man frowned, deeply regretting that he hadn't yet been able to regain his powers. He didn't know what would happen next. But suddenly the man's eyes widened, turning around. His mouth barely opened in surprise. The brunette noticed a weapon stuck in the ground next to the skeleton. For a second, Seo-do-jun was speechless. He froze in place, carefully examining the weapon in front of him. It seemed as if the world stood still for a moment. Then, Seo-do-jun frowned and closed his eyes. But shaking his head, he looked at the sword again. Jun said he had no choice. Besides, he believed that the sword's age didn't matter. Only the wielder's skill mattered. The sword was quite dirty. Gripping it tighter in his hands, Seo-do-jun walked toward the monster. When the monster wanted to attack the boy again, he pulled out his sword towards the viper in front of him. Seo-do-jun quietly asked to borrow the sword for a moment. Then came the loud sounds of blows. A moment later, Jun leaped high into the air, ready to slice through the armor of the black viper in front of him. He swung again. Seo-do-jun's eyes widened, saying that this damn viper should be proud, because he was the one who would kill her. Then the man's sword seemed to glow bright red. Seo-do-jun's grip on the sword's hilt tightened. And then the viper howled loudly in pain, releasing huge drops of green poison from its mouth. For a moment, Seo-do-jun's eyes seemed to turn white. The man prepared to strike the viper again. Seo-do-jun pierced the snake's body, and bright rays of sunlight began to emanate from the monster's body. A loud scream was heard. Small stones began to fall from the tunnel ceiling. Seo-do-jun stood his ground, tensely pressing his lips together. Behind him lay the corpse of a monster. Jun's sword shattered, and then he realized that disaster was about to strike. Slowly approaching the monster's corpse, Seo-do-jun barely raised his head. His movements were cautious. The man pulled a fang from a viper. Jun said it was a bit short for a two-handed sword, but it could be used for something useful. Closing his eyes, Seo-do-jun said tiredly that he was still glad because it was better than Namsan. Seo-do-jun emerged from the tunnel late at night. He couldn't believe he'd spent so much time on the B-rank gate. The man then clenched his fist, realizing that restoring his strength would now be his top priority. Looking up at the sky, Jun thought of his comrades from the past. He was glad they couldn't see him in his current state. Next to the store, in the Hero Complex, an entertainer in a strange yellow cat costume danced, attracting customers. A man stood in his store. He placed a large quantity of magic stones on the counter. The seller told him that the man had collected several high-level stones, but the commission would be 40%. The man said it was a bit expensive, so he asked for a discount since he was a regular customer. The seller said they already had the lowest commission. He insisted the control center charged a 5% commission. The salesman told the customer, handing over the money, that it was a clean and convenient transaction at a good price. But in response, the man simply began to count the money he had received, thinking for a moment. The customer asked what happened to the salesman's face. He was badly beaten and had bandages all over his body. The seller said with displeasure that some psycho came to them out of nowhere and then beat him and the security guard. The client said Al had been too relaxed around the security guards. He believed ranks were merely for bureaucratic convenience, but true ability was a different matter. The man insisted that there was a huge gap between a security guard who had just received his license and a hero who risked his life. Al silently told the customer to shut up. The man said that if the salesman needed help, he could call him. Having laughed, the customer hurried out of the store. A man approached him, heading for the counter. It was June, who had already passed by the previous customer and was looking indifferently at the salesman in front of him. Seeing a painfully familiar face, the salesman immediately frowned. He even opened his eye, which was very sore from the fight. And then, a moment later, Al was already screaming loudly, pointing his finger at the hero. He said that it was he who had beaten him. The previous client asked again in surprise, saying that this guy was quite tall and looked neat. The man, flexing his fists, asked June if he really beats up civilians first and then calls himself a hero. Al smiled, thinking that the previous client was a 7-year veteran with many familiar heroes. But in response, Seodo Jun merely advised the man to back off. The salesman was momentarily surprised. Hearing the boy's insolence, the veteran immediately lost his temper. He frowned deeply, clenching his teeth even tighter. But the red-haired salesman didn't seem to care. He only smiled even brighter as he watched the proceedings. Seodo Jun turned wearily, looking at the man behind him. He asked if he really wanted to avenge his friend. Then the veteran tensed even more, clenching his fist tighter. He called the brunette in front of him an ordinary kid. The veteran then remembered that most hero deaths were due to battles with other heroes, not monsters. Then the man awkwardly scratched his neck, saying he had to run errands. He turned and hurried away. Looking away from the veteran, Seodo Jun turned his attention to the salesman standing behind him. He froze in surprise. Jun asked if the seller had any complaints against him. Al bowed his head, immediately breaking out in a sweat of fear. But, as if ignoring the seller's expression, Seodo Jun simply threw the backpack containing the magic stones at him. Seodo Jun ordered the red-haired salesman to calculate how much he could get for these magic stones. Al looked in surprise at the backpack full of high-level magic stones. He couldn't figure out who Jun was. But the seller decided to pay Seodo Jun anyway, so he began to count the cost of each stone. The seller said it was 150 million won. Then the man began examining the stones. But Seodo Jun was clearly dissatisfied with the fact that he had only received 150 million for a whole day of hunting. The salesman reminded him that there was still a commission to be deducted. Meeting the customer's angry gaze, Al became alarmed. So Dojun just sighed, saying that everything was correct, and with the commission, he came to 148.5 million. Al wanted to curse, but he only said that transactions over 100 million won required approval from his superiors. So Dojun responded with displeasure, saying that in that case, the seller should get it right away. The red-haired salesman decided to call his boss, explaining the whole situation. He moved away from the register and lowered his voice to a whisper. Seodo Jun cut L off, snatching the phone from his hands. The man froze in surprise for a moment. Seodo Jun took the phone in his hands, telling him to tell the seller to pay him for the stones. The boss replied that he understood everything, but still asked for the phone to be returned to the employee. But Jun turned his gaze to Al. A moment later, Seodo Jun threw the phone against the wall. The force of the impact seemed to shatter the wall. The man said that the seller's management had given his consent, so he should pay for the goods. With a heavy sigh, the red-haired salesman handed the man stacks of money. His voice trembled with fear. Jun smiled and said that next time, everything should be fine. L, however, didn't understand when coercion had become the norm. 10 minutes later, the store doors opened again. A man hurried inside. The middle-aged brunette asked in alarm why L wasn't picking up and what the last call had been about. The red-haired salesman wearily told his boss he was quitting. He shook his head, looking away from his superior. Al insisted he couldn't work like this anymore. The boss's gaze caught the employee's phone on the wall. Then the boss's gaze immediately changed, becoming more stern and severe. The man frowned deeply. The salesman looked perplexed at the change in his boss's expression. For a moment, the guy even looked surprised. A moment later, the boss finally decided to call an acquaintance. Her name was Ju-yeon. Immediately after asking them to come to their store, the purple-haired girl headed towards them. People on the street looked at the girl, turned to follow her, and whispered. But Ju-yeon paid no attention. People standing around couldn't believe that they were able to see the real Hyun Ju-yeon in person. The girl had violet eyes and long hair. Her bangs barely touched her glasses, which sparkled in the sun. After passing through a huge crowd of people, Hyunju-yeon stopped near a store where the stone trading was taking place. When the girl entered, a certain man greeted her warmly at the entrance. The red-haired salesman let out a loud cry, either from surprise or joy. He too couldn't believe he'd seen Hyunju-yeon. The girl winked at the seller and smiled brightly, saying that it really was her. Al understood that the fourth S-rank hero stood before him. He heard that she was his boss's niece. The girl said that her uncle told her about problems with some hero who was forcing them to buy stones. Sitting down on the sofa, Hyunju-yeon asked him to explain the situation in more detail. She bowed her head wearily. It was a warm day outside. Eun-young was playing with the toys she'd been given in the courtyard. At this time, So Do-jun was sitting nearby in the lotus position, trying to meditate. Even hunting all day long, he barely made 100 million. It was too slow. So Do-jun needed to start hunting alone in the highest-ranked gates as soon as possible. For this, he needed to immediately restore his former strength. But unlike the previous world, in this atmosphere, mana was hard to find. At this rate, collecting mana would take 3 years. It would be nice to get some good weapons and equipment. However, in this world, even the worst weapons cost hundreds of millions. There was a sudden sound, and Eun-young turned around, panic filling her eyes. So Do-jun immediately ran up to the girl and picked her up in his arms, telling her to quickly come into the house. He threw the girl into the house and very quickly closed the front door behind them. A stunned grandmother watched this scene, asking what had happened. But the answer came of its own accord. A loud sound came from the street, startling everyone in the house. The ground began to shake beneath her feet. Eun-young began to struggle against her grip, and her grandmother screamed about an earthquake. But So Do-jun knew it most likely wasn't an earthquake. He had another theory. So Do-jun knew better than anyone that the rifts had become too chaotic lately to be logical. And what had just appeared above their house emitted similar energy, almost like a rift. This meant that the young man had reason to believe that they were at the epicenter of events, right under the new fault. Looking out the window, his suspicions were only confirmed. He saw that the entire sky was covered in purple cracks. The young man threw his sister into the arms of his bewildered grandmother and rushed towards the exit. He told his household that it was dangerous outside and forbade them to go out, while he himself threw himself into the ravine. Meanwhile, a commotion erupted in the majestic building of the Seoul Heroes Association. Numerous agents were pacing around the office, worried that a new rift had been discovered in Mapo. The man in glasses was clearly indignant that a new rift had formed 63 days later. He ordered the agents to contact the White Lion Guild as soon as possible, as they were closest to the scene. He asked again where exactly the location of the fault was recorded, and was told that the fault appeared in the courtyard of a residential building. The man in glasses began to worry. It was problematic because if an ordinary person entered the new rift, no one else would be able to enter. And if that person dies, the waves of monsters will not stop for 10 whole days. If that happens, all of Seoul will be in danger. Monsters will take to the streets and start killing. The bespectacled man asked about the identity of the person who had entered the rift. One of the agents told him that the person's name was So Do-jun. He entered the rift zone trying to save his little sister. So, according to the agent's assumptions, he was not a hero. On the screen of the small computer that calculated the chances of losing, a number almost equal to 100 popped up. At that moment, the entire office was plunged into darkness. Now the future of all of Seoul was in the hands of someone who was no hero. Meanwhile, in another corner of Seoul, an angry woman threw a pile of papers on the table. It was the same stepmother who asked the detective what So Do-jun's awakening meant. The man in the suit replied that even though Do-junyi had not yet registered with the Hero Association, there was no doubt that he had awakened in the gate. The woman lost her temper because she sincerely did not understand how her perfect plan could turn out like this. She slammed her fist on the table and shouted that Kang Chol-woo should have killed that bastard. She asked Manager Lee to tell Kang Chol-woo that if he couldn't kill Do-jun, he would pay a heavy price. The man replied that he doubted they would be able to contact him as a new fault had appeared in Jun's house. The unfortunate bodyguard said that they had confirmed that Dojun had entered that rift and that they would soon report it to the media. The woman was a little glad that they would no longer see this vile creature. She looked at her bodyguard with determination in her eyes and asked him to watch until he was completely convinced. And Soto Jun found himself in a rift. Not at its very epicenter, but in the rift. The sun still shone brightly above his head. It was almost no different from the real world. The young man walked confidently among the trees, trying to understand where exactly he needed to go. Everything was going perfectly. He couldn't believe he was actually in the rift now. This rift was the very same Patissier forest where he often walked as a child. The shape of the forest, the trees, the grass, and of course the wind. It was all the same as it had been in his childhood. The atmosphere was rich in mana. He also had a clear idea of where the exit from the rift might be. So Dojun smiled and was glad that he had fallen into this particular rift. Walking a little further, he saw in front of him what was called the World Tree. It was an ancient, sacred tree from which a stream of pure mana flowed. This played into Dojun's hands. The reason his world was destroyed was because that tree was burned and the source of mana was lost. And it is not clear why, but this tree was still alive here, in this rift. This gave Soto Jun a unique opportunity to bring back the mana of that time. He resolutely headed towards the roots of the tree to try to regain his former strength. Dojun began meditating again to quickly acquire mana. It wasn't an easy task. Magical power pierced his body, and due to the fact that Seo Dojun was not a good warrior in life, it was difficult to contain the mana. He'd already spent enough time in this rift. But the young man was willing to spend as much time as it took. Forgetting even about food and water, he concentrated only on breathing for 10 days. The night of the 10th day was suspiciously quiet, but so far there were no signs of the enemy. Suddenly, footsteps were heard in the midst of all the silence. This made So Dojun's eyes widen. There, in the thicket of the forest, making their way from behind the trees, Vulcans approached the tree. These monsters were the ones who burned the world tree in the past and doomed the world to eternal suffering. And now, all these monsters were heading straight for the tree, possibly trying to kill Dojun. The young man thought that it would be very nice to have a sword with the water attribute on him now, but this would do too. The Vulcan attacked the boy, moving very quickly toward him. Fire emanated from their heads and they looked terrifying. Seeing how persistent his old enemies were, Dojun became enraged. He no longer needed his sword. He had restored enough mana and was ready to crush these nobodies into pieces. The next moment, he gathered his mana into the palms of his hands and directed an attack towards the attackers. The Vulcan apparently didn't expect any resistance. They clutched their heads in pain. Dojun's eyes were empty. He could finally avenge his ruined world. The Vulcan had no intention of retreating. Apparently, they didn't realize how serious their opponent was. So Dojun didn't even move or try to retreat. He was waiting for the right moment to attack. He planned to release the accumulated mana in the form of chi and thereby cause an explosion. So Dojun exhaled and thought that it had been a long time since he had spilled so much mana. The Vulcan were preparing to attack the World Tree, or Dojun. They were gathering energy for the strike. The next moment, several purple clots of energy flew at So Dojun. Dojun watched the approaching attacks for a while, knowing full well that they posed no threat to him. Indeed, the clots of energy stopped right in front of his body, as if thrown back by the barrier, without ever touching him. Now that he was sure that the World Tree was safe, Dojun was ready to attack. He looked at Vulcan with a crazy look and, smiling, offered to test his mana in action. The young man slightly stretched his neck, which had become stiff from long meditation, and walked towards his opponents. The Vulcan were preparing to strike again. They were gathering energy in their mouths again. But this time, So Dojun wasn't going to just watch. He stuck his hand into Vulcana's mouth. In this way, Dojun tried to tear out this not yet formed clot of energy. And his attack succeeded. Blue light from his mana spilled across the area. The Vulcan members were acting rather strangely. Their heads would burst into flames again, then go out. And then they all fell dead, crumbling into ash. Each dropped a magic stone. So Jun announced that his mana check was complete and headed towards the other Vulcan. The young man said with a smile that he had come up with a new plan. He turned to the bewildered Vulcan and asked if he would get the eternal sparks if he dealt with them. Then he answered his own question. The probability of sparks was indeed high. After thinking about how many sparks he would receive, the young man began to hit Vulcan, scattering them left and right. After some time, Vulcan's attack came to an end. Jun stood under a tree, about to count his catch. On the ground, between a pile of magic stones, lay something golden and shiny. Jun reached out his hand towards the object. This was what he had been hunting for all this time. Jun held one of those eternal sparks in his hands. He hadn't seen such an object for over 10 years. The young man clenched his fist, and the spark burst into flame. He was glad to have them again. Now an orange, uncontrollable flame emanated from his palm. It looked quite menacing. It was the first time Jun had smiled in a while. He was genuinely happy about the spark. He would have liked to obtain more mana from the World Tree, but unfortunately, it would have been too much for his body. But now he had this spark, which meant he could absorb them. It wasn't a mana replenishment, of course, but he now had the opportunity to change his mana to the fire attribute. After absorbing one spark, the young man's entire body began to emit light, and tongues of flame enveloped him. Jun remembered how in the past he was completely uninterested in such sparks, and he literally threw them away. But now it was weaker. Now it took 10 minutes just to absorb a spark. The young man looked at the pile of golden, shiny stones under his feet and thought of something. He decided that now he had to absorb as many of these sparks as he could. People looked up in amazement, examining the new rift. It sparkled with a bright purple light, which was both mesmerizing and terrifying. Reporters tried to capture as many moments as possible. The crowd screamed and whispered, unable to cope with the overwhelming horror. One of the men cursed loudly, clenching his teeth tighter. He frowned deeply, not taking his gaze off the rift. Bang Sung-woo was one of the agents at the control center. He told his colleague that this whole mess was all because of one guy. Kim Hyun-woo replied that the boy simply wanted to save his sister. He glanced at his watch and smiled brightly. Bang San-woo exclaimed that this was only the official version, but in fact, the guy had heard about light awakenings in the rifts. But a colleague interrupted him and asked what Kil Ma-hyun thought. She simply told them to follow instructions. The blue-haired guy replied that faults had also occurred in the United States, China, Britain, Turkey, and Switzerland. Kim Hyun-woo said that Kil Ma must have a lot of problems because this is the first time something like this has happened. Bang Sung-woo exclaimed that they were the only ones left in the red in the end. He believed that this whole thing was due to that useless idiot. The agent exclaimed that if that guy came out of the rift, he would beat the crap out of him. But the rift only widened with each passing second. It formed in the air, growing like stalks. The news said it had been 28 days since the rift opened, and the Hero Association had announced a wave of monsters. They showed Jun's blurred face. They insisted that this ordinary man had gone in there first and still hadn't come out. But a moment later, as if not wanting to even hear about this stupid chatter, a certain man turned off the TV screen. The man, who had been watching TV with boredom, let out a heavy sigh and said that the person in question was Jun. Kim In-gu, who approached his boss from behind, said that it was definitely Jun, since it had already been confirmed. Wang Jong-sub asked how likely he was to return alive. The assistant replied that it was unlikely the man would make it out alive. But in response, Hwang Jong-sub just laughed, saying that that bastard was clearly not human. The boss said those idiots from the Hero Association were misinformed. He glanced at his beaten subordinates. Hwang Jong-seob suddenly asked if it was possible that Jun was awakened. After bowing, the assistant said that everything depended on Jun's rank, so it was difficult to judge. Relaxing for a moment, Hwang Jung-sob said that fighting well and surviving in the rifts were two different things. The boss said that So Do-jun still has two living family members, so they need to be checked. Kim En-gu asked what he wanted to do with them. Hwang replied that for now, he planned to simply keep them safe. Hwang Jung-song said that if Jun died, they would sell his family for organs. If he returned, they would saddle him with the debt for caring for his family. Before the guy's eyes, there was a huge tree, inside of which a portal of sky blue color seemed to open. So Do-jun's body was engulfed in bright flames. His eyes glowed white. He had no idea how much time had passed. He looked at his hand, realizing that this was what was called the unquenchable spark, which he had absorbed by the hundreds. Jun understood that he could now use fire mana whenever he wanted, and his fire resistance had increased greatly. Jun was pleased that, if only the fire attribute was counted, he was in better shape than when he was named the Sword God. Then the brunette barely touched the tree trunk, closing his eyes for a moment. Then the man began to whisper softly, looking at the mighty tree before him. It seemed as if bright sparks were floating around it. So Do-jun thanked the peace tree for everything it had given him over these 2 lives. The man then knelt down and began to collect the magical stones, which sparkled with a bright red light. The man collected the stones in a bag and sat down on the ground in front of the tree. He said he would likely never see the peace tree again. Smiling, the boy promised that if they met again and the tree was in danger, he would protect it at any cost. Then So Do-jun finally stood up from the ground and turned around. He was finally about to leave the rift. A few moments later, the moon appeared before his eyes, illuminating the night streets of Seoul. When Jun emerged from the portal, his face seemed to respond with bright flashes of fire. It was as if he had been pushed out of the rift. Then the boy landed on the ground and tried to keep his balance. He almost tripped. After quickly surveying the area, So Do-jun realized that all the residents had been evacuated in preparation for the wave. But looking towards a certain house, the guy felt someone's presence in that direction. That's why So Do-jun decided to run there as quickly as possible and check who was there. Kim Hyun-woo stood there, once again making fun of the ever-disgruntled Bang Sung-woo. Jun carefully peeked out from around the corner. So Do-jun frowned and quickly realized that if those guys from the center caught him, it would cause big problems. And then the guy decided to use his new abilities, turning the air around his hand into a bright flame. Then tongues of fire swirled around So Do-jun. With one easy movement, the boy directed the flames upward. Just a moment later, the fire had already reached the highest roof of all those nearby. For a moment, everything was silent. So Do-jun simply watched what was happening, not moving from his spot. A moment later, a loud explosion was heard. Suddenly, the entire house was engulfed in flames, and some of the building's remains were sent plummeting. Kim Hyun-woo immediately turned around, startled, asking what the sound was. Bang Sung-woo's eyes widened in surprise. Agents from the Gate Control Center immediately rushed to the blazing building. The fire was spreading more and more rapidly by the second. A small crowd of ordinary people stopped outside the building. Kim Hyun-woo froze in surprise, not understanding what was happening. Bang Sung-woo cursed, unable to understand how such a large flame could have appeared in such an ordinary building. Kim Hyun-woo frowned in response. So Do-jun also watched the fire from afar, but his only thought was that the fire's power and accuracy were quite good. The brunette looked at his hand in surprise, thinking that such a flame would obviously impress those around him. Jun realized that he could be satisfied, because after all, in his past life, he was the most powerful fire mage on the continent. Suddenly, Kim Hyun-woo tilted his head forward, his eyes wide. He froze in place in sudden surprise. Turning around quickly, the blue-haired guy asked his colleague to pay attention to something. Kim Hyun-woo kept saying the rift felt strange. It seemed to have shrunk in size. Bang Sung-woo asked again. Looking closer, they could indeed see significant changes in the rift. And then, both agents from the control center rushed forward, trying to prevent a catastrophe. They ran forward. Bang Sung-woo, like his colleague Kim Hyun-woo, suddenly stopped in his tracks, his eyes wide in surprise. The guy frowned. It felt as if the man was gasping for air. The agent couldn't move, as if he couldn't believe what was happening. And then the boy loudly exclaimed that the rift was indeed disappearing. The purple portal began to shrink sharply. Shodo-jun no longer followed the agents from the center. He slung his bag over his shoulder and hurried away from the scene. But still, after a few moments, the boy turned around. His yellow eyes seemed to sparkle brightly in the darkness. The next day, the news reported that the new fault in Mappo had disappeared early in the morning. This news received widespread publicity. The TVs were saying that the Hero Association that predicted the wave of monsters was already investigating the causes. Reporters also reported an unexplained fire that broke out at a landfill near the fault. People on the streets were greatly surprised. The journalist said Mr. So was probably already dead. People in the area started whispering that the guy deserved it. Some tried to defend June. Other passers-by insisted that if the rift hadn't closed, Seoul would have become a battlefield. After hearing all the rumors, Sodo-jun became upset because he realized that he would most likely never see the world tree again. Looking up at the sky, Sodo-jun adjusted his cap and hood. He had deliberately dressed very discreetly, hiding his face. Looking up at the sky with the bright sun, Sodo-jun remembered that there were still things he had to protect. Approaching an old building, the man suddenly stopped. He began to carefully examine the signs on the walls. Then, Sodo-jun entered the house and noticed several guys standing in front of him. They were smoking, laughing loudly, and talking. One of the guys said that since that bastard was dead, the old lady and the girl were done for too. The other replied that they could get 10 times what those bastards were actually worth. The brunette said that the girl could grow up to be very beautiful, so the boss was probably already thinking about how to use her. But suddenly a third person intervened in their conversation. For a moment, the two boys froze, turning around in surprise. Sodo-jun approached them, asking where their boss was. They were standing in an old room near the landing. After some time, a black car finally pulled up to the building. It looked as if the house had been in dire need of repair for a long time. A man sighed heavily and slowly stepped out of the car. It seemed as if he was having trouble even walking. It was a middle-aged man who had decided to comb his hair. Following him was his assistant, Kim In-gu. Hwang Jong-seob laughed, saying that since that guy was dead, he could finally sleep peacefully. Asking about the schedule, the boss immediately received an answer. Kim rattled off that he had lunch with Director Beck at lunchtime. Hwang ordered to contact Madam Kang and ask her to prepare new girls, because he was supposed to come to her in the evening. Hwang Jong-seob began to climb the stairs where So-do-jun had recently stood. Suddenly, the man's eyes widened in fear. His sunglasses nearly fell off. A man was thrown into a wall right before his eyes. Kim In-gu instinctively took a step back. For just a moment, Hwang Jong-seob froze. At the same time, blood began to spurt from the victim's mouth. But then the boss got it too. The guy threw him against the wall, causing him to hit the floor painfully. Sodo-jun stood over the bodies scattered across the room. Hwang Jong-seob coughed loudly, trying to catch his breath. Frowning, Sodo-jun sternly told him that Mr. Hwang would have to crawl on all fours from now on. Sweat poured down his face. Mr. Hwang began to tremble violently with fear, as if he couldn't even stand on his own 2 feet. Sodo-jun sat down in the boss's seat, which stood nearby. He covered his face with his cap again, looking down for a moment. The boy glanced at Hwang Jong-seob, who was kneeling. Sodo-jun asked if he hadn't heard him. A moment later, Sodo-jun swung his legs up onto Mr. Hwang's desk. Mr. Hwang slowly began to crawl. Sodo-jun ordered Hwan to bark, saying that bastards like him didn't deserve to be treated like humans. A second later, the man screamed that he should bark like a dog. Mr. Hwang closed his eyes in shame. But just a moment later, a long, drawn-out human bark reached Sodo-jun's ears. The man barked even louder, raising his head at Sodo-jun. Frowning, Hwang made his face even more disgusting. At the same time, the rest of the workers, who did not dare look at their boss, stood facing the wall. The boy left the table and sat down on the floor next to Mr. Hwang. He told him to speak up. Jun said that Hwang appears very submissive and devoted to his face. But he also reminded him that he's ready to stab you in the back at any opportunity. Leaning over, June asked Huang if he thought this was really his first time handling a rat like this. Huang Jung-sob lowered his head, begging for forgiveness and mercy. He insisted he would be more loyal than a dog. But in response, Sodo-jun only ordered the man to shut his mouth. He slapped him in the face with all his might. The man then flew back, blood spurting from his nose and mouth. Jun shook his head indifferently. Then, suddenly, Sodo-jun turned to the bespectacled Kim En-gu, who had been standing to the side all this time. Sodo-jun breathed a sigh of relief, saying that Kim would be the boss now. He believed it was time to stop serving scum. Jun knew that killing the bosses was no problem for their business, so he let Kim do it. Swallowing hard, Kim En-gu tensed. He only pressed his lips together tighter, looking at the boy in front of him. Bowing, Kim said that his boss had a lot of connections, so if he became the boss, everyone would become suspicious. Smiling awkwardly, Mr. Kim said that So-do-jun could spare his boss this once instead. Jun said that it would be better for Kim to throw the boss into a barrel and throw him into the sea, or crush him in a landfill, because that is his profession. So-do-jun said that if Mr. Kim doesn't want to do that, then he can just throw them all into the A-rank gate. Then, Kim En-gu's gaze immediately changed. His eyes widened in terror, refusing to become monster fodder. And the man, whose face was completely smeared with blood, immediately raised a frightened gaze to Seo-do-jun. Then Huang Jong-sub begged for mercy and forgiveness. He bowed, declaring that he would forever be his faithful dog. The man nearly sobbed as he swore eternal devotion. For a moment, So-do-jun froze, his eyes wide. The boy knew that if Huang were removed, everything would be fine. His gaze immediately changed, and then he exhaled heavily. A moment later, the boy quietly whispered a question under his breath. Jun asked if he had really softened. So-do-jun said he would spare Mr. Huang. He reached out to his boss's face. He looked up in surprise. Then the man smiled brightly, as if he couldn't believe his own luck. His eyes widened. With trembling hands, Mr. Huang Jong-seob extended his hand to Seo-do-jun. He said he had been wrong all along. The man insisted that from now on, he would serve only So-do-jun. But suddenly, he looked down in surprise. The hand he touched Seo-do-jun with was already burning brightly. The man screamed loudly in pain. The flames reflected in Jun's eyes. That guy said this was Mr. Huang's last chance. So-do-jun removed his hand with the flame from Huang Jong-sub. The man immediately recoiled, writhing in agony. A few moments later, the man's arm fell off his body, now turning into ordinary soot. It quickly dissipated in the wind. Mr. Huang continued to scream loudly, looking at the remaining part of his arm. So-do-jun, meanwhile, hurried out of the building. Turning around, Jun said that if any of his family got even a scratch, they would all die. They were now obligated to guard his relatives around the clock. Officially, Do-jun was considered missing, having disappeared into the rift. But only a few knew that he had not actually disappeared. Now he was sitting with his sister in a restaurant while the police, the Heroes Association, and all the other media did not calm down. Everyone treated Do-jun as the one who died and protected Seoul from the rift. Do-jun weighed the pros and cons, thinking that if he declared that he was alive, it would only cause problems. Soon, Huang Chang-sup had to find a new home, and his family had to move in peace. Do-jun watched his sister gobble up burgers and was overjoyed. Eun-young smiled widely and said that she liked the fact that they were moving. So-do-jun said that his sister will now be able to go to kindergarten with other children and will go to school next year. After these words, the girl, for some reason, became a little sad. Do-jun looked at her with confusion and asked if she didn't like kindergarten. The girl said that children tease her because she doesn't have a mom and dad. Do-jun's face darkened as he tried to come up with a solution. And then he said she didn't have to go there. No need to see those little brats' faces. The girl was immediately happy that she didn't have to go to kindergarten. Do-jun thought that he should send his sister to a prestigious private school so that no one would look down on her. That same evening, Do-jun made a scene with one of the poor guys he had hired. That man offered an elderly man and a little girl a place to stay in a motel. He obviously had no brains at all. Their company ran the motel, so the young man didn't mean any harm. Dojun asked him to forget about it and then headed to his family. Eunyoung broke free from her grandmother's embrace and attacked Seo Dojun. Grandma was happy too. She was glad that Dojun had returned alive. Little Eunyoung was almost crying with happiness. She couldn't stop hugging her brother. Dojun had never experienced such affection from someone before, so he was perplexed. But the bewilderment quickly gave way to a smile. After all, at least he was doing something right. Eunyoung looked at her brother and asked if he was one of the heroes too. So Dojun asked the girl if she really wanted him to be a hero, to which she replied that she didn't want to. Dojun didn't understand what she meant, so he asked again what was wrong with the hero status. Eunyoung replied that heroes fight scary monsters and sometimes die. And Eunyoung and Grandma would like Dojun to stay alive and be with them forever. Eunyoung's face darkened a little, and she repeated once again that she wanted her brother to be with her always. Sho Dojun was about to say something. He even took a deep breath, but then suddenly fell silent. He bowed his head down and still couldn't find what he should say. He couldn't promise Eunyoung anything. Even in the cruel world of the past, he was a man who survived until the very end. In that past world, he lost a lot during the endless fight with monsters. But now something valuable that he had forgotten has reappeared in his life. In this world, So Dojun was going to live protecting his little happiness. The commotion in the hero corporations hadn't died down all this time. Now the helicopter was flying toward the corporation building. That helicopter was heading straight to the headquarters of the Heroes Association in Korea. There, on the top floor of a building with panoramic windows, stood a man, saying that they could not find out anything. The man was the founder of the Korean Heroes Association, Na Tae-hwan. His client responded that they couldn't determine anything at the moment. Na Tae-hwan expressed indignation and said that the rift, which once disappeared on its own, could open again. The girl agreed, saying that the variables were dangerous and it would be much better if a wave of monsters hit. But her boss immediately reprimanded her, telling her to think about what she was saying. The safety of civilians was far more important. Na Tae-hwan was one of the 100 most respected heroes on the planet. If he had decided to run for president, he would have been elected with the highest percentage of votes. This man had power, but he didn't care about that power. He truly cared only about the safety of the people. Na Tae-hwan asked his protege to explore everything, even if it took a long time. She also reported that a resident of a house in the fault zone had agreed to sell. Na Tae-hwan asked him to pay above market price. The boss opened his laptop and started looking for something there. Then he looked in surprise at what appeared on the small screen. He looked at the map, where it was clear that the fault had appeared in other countries as well. This was unusual. His client asked if the US and China had entered a control phase. So why were there fault lines there? Na Tae-hwan said the problem was in England. Reliable heroes were sent to other rifts. A new message immediately appeared on the computer. The boss was as surprised as if he'd just seen a ghost. He cried out that this couldn't be true. He looked at his screen again and announced loudly that a rift had been discovered in England. At the same time, the one who was declared dead was heading towards the city center. Dojun walked slowly along the busy street, trying not to attract too much attention to himself. He reached a small shop with a garish red sign and went inside. The new customer notification system started ringing as soon as the young man appeared at the door. The seemingly exhausted employee greeted the guy listlessly, and raising his eyes, the boy screamed as if he had seen a ghost instead of Dojun. The employee turned to the man sitting at the desk and shouted to the manager that it was the man. The manager closed the newspaper with an impassive expression and asked what his employee meant. He then stood up and asked if Dojun had been forcing the employees to sell the magic stones without commission in his absence. Dojun wasn't at all flustered. He reached into his backpack, saying he'd brought some more rocks. The young man threw his backpack on the floor, and the clattering sound of several dozen stones could be heard. The manager said that they would not do business with Dojun and asked him to leave. Hearing this, the young man was perplexed and asked again if the manager was sure of his words. To which the manager began to explain that a 1% commission meant nothing but losses for them. Realizing that these people no longer wanted to work with him, Jun said that they would regret it. The head of this establishment scratched his head, not intending to explain why even the gate center takes a commission. Then he turned around, looked at the guest, and coldly ordered him to take the stones and leave immediately. But Jun wasn't about to give up. He kicked his backpack. A moment later, the backpack fell to the floor and a multitude of magic stones spilled out. The face of the employee who had been so angry before completely changed, twisting into a strange grimace. The manager, in turn, was also shocked when he saw what was in the guy's bag. No one could believe that the hero's magical stones were actually there. Where did this guy get such rare stones? Jun looked at the two losers and told them to forget about him if they weren't interested in such stones. The hero's magical stones were indeed a local curiosity. They looked like a red mineral with a blue star. Kerzaman, a famous drug trafficker in Mexico, bought magical stones for use in drug production. And then something irreparable happened. He couldn't have expected the stone in his hands to explode, but this turned out to be his advantage. The magic stone's power manifested itself, and he awoke as a hero. This stone was a powerful source of energy, extremely expensive due to how difficult it was to obtain. Jun looked down on the two shocked workers and asked them to put everything in the bag. The manager immediately came to his senses, not wanting to lose such precious stones. He asked Jun to sit down and wait a bit. The poor worker, who had complained so much, now humbly wiped the blood off the stones. And Jun calmly sipped a refreshing iced drink and listened to the manager's apology. The manager was clearly unhappy with the 0.5% commission, as it would have almost meant the end of his business. Jun, who had been listening to this nagging for the 100th time, repeated that if the manager didn't like something, he would calmly leave. The manager still didn't want to lose such a customer, but asked why Jun had reduced the commission to 0.5%, to which he replied that they had made him angry. After such an answer, the manager rushed to apologize with all his might. Jun, tired of listening to apologies, just wanted to know if the manager would adjust the commission for him. The worker wiping the stones was still angry, but he couldn't show it. This client was too valuable. It didn't take much persuasion. The manager finally agreed to lower the commission. The man immediately began a long monologue about the value of magic stones, but Jun interrupted him halfway through. Realizing the manager wanted to raise the commission, Jun turned to leave. The manager ran after him, asking for at least 9% commission. When Jun didn't show much favor, the manager asked for an 8% commission. The poor worker stood and watched as some young man forced his boss to reduce the commission again and again. Eventually, the manager lost all hope that he could raise the commission above 0.5%. And when all hope was lost, Jun took pity and allowed the commission to be settled at 1%. The manager immediately screamed that the young man was a robber. But no matter how much he wanted to put him in his place, he couldn't do anything. So Jun smiled slightly, about to say something else. When he said he had 7 more of these bags, the manager was perplexed. And the employee wiping the stones didn't look much happier either. The manager immediately asked the employee to bring their contract so as not to lose such a client. A few hours later, after counting and wiping the stones, Jun received a money transfer from the manager. He looked at the 67 million won figure on the screen and thought that, at this rate, buying a house was just around the corner. His main problem was that the gates were not enough to collect high-level magic stones. If only he could move freely into the rift zones, life would be easier. Just as he was thinking about the rift, the ground suddenly shook. The manager standing next to him was startled. Jun continued to stare at the phone screen, where a notification was now visible. The message spoke of a wave in southern England. Jun was already formulating a plan. The young man looked again at the notification, then at the manager, breathing a sigh of relief, and was now sure of what to do next. Jun lowered his head and peered into the distance, his lips pressed tightly together, deep in thought. In front of his face hung a warning that a wave had formed in the southern region of England. Then the brunette immediately raised his steely gaze. He looked ahead, as if he had decided something. Then Sodo-jun suddenly turned around, talking about people without abilities. The man behind him looked puzzled. Jun recalled that before, no matter what country he was in, he would go and stop the rift zone. But now, as he walked past the crowd, he decided that he would no longer live by these principles. After some time, fresh meat was being fried before his eyes and carefully turned over. Lee Eun-young stared in fascination at the juicy pieces of meat before her. A bewildered grandmother sat next to her. The waiter began to tell them about the dish, and the girl listened attentively, her mouth wide open. With her head down, the grandmother asked June if 250,000 won for 100 grams wasn't too expensive. The brunette, drinking water, said that this time he had earned a lot of money, so they could eat as much as they wanted. The girl then blew lightly on the hot piece of meat. She opened her mouth wide, preparing to taste the dish. Then Lee Eun-young smiled widely, finally trying the new food. The girl's brown eyes sparkled brightly. It seemed as if even her childish cheeks had a slight blush. Then the girl closed her eyes, savoring the taste of fresh meat. Her mouth opened wide, as if glowing with happiness. Grandma, however, was still looking very cautiously at the pieces of meat frying on the stove in front of her. She frowned slightly. Then Sodo-jun's eyes widened, staring somewhere. For a moment, his yellow gaze dropped. He asked the waiter to bring them 4 porridge ribs, prime beef tenderloin, chuck tail, and swallow's nest. Grandma asked if the brunette had ordered too much. She doubted they would be able to eat it all. In response, June smiled brightly, saying that today they should eat their fill. Therefore, Grandma should eat a lot too. Then the old woman shook her head, sighing heavily. Lee Eun-young handed her a fork with the meat already skewered on it. The girl said the meat was delicious, so she should try it soon. Then Eun-young smiled brightly. Grandma decided to listen to her granddaughter's advice, so she slowly began to eat the dishes on the table. Grandma liked the taste too. She was pleasantly surprised and smiled broadly, looking at Sodo-jun. The old woman then laughed, exchanging glances with her youngest granddaughter. Lee Eun-young laughed in response. But suddenly, a blurry image of a girl with purple hair appeared behind them. She was heading towards them. Suddenly, Hyun-ju-yeon stopped a few meters from the table. The rest of the cafeteria turned around. The girl called out to Mr. Sodo-jun. He turned around with displeasure, trying to quickly finish the hot meat. Ju-yeon came closer and then asked the brunette if they could talk. The guy froze for a moment. Ju-yeon addressed him as a hero, but he interrupted her. June asked if she couldn't see that he was spending time with his family. Frowning, the guy said that if Ju-yeon had any business with him, then they should come over after they had lunch. For a moment, the girl froze. She was even at a loss, not quite sure how to react to this rudeness. The girl smiled, perplexed by his behavior. She knew she was respected in society, and so she hadn't expected this. Moving a little further from the table, the girl suddenly wondered who the man in front of her was. She lowered her head for a moment. And then the girl decided to go to the waiting area, which was located nearby. Ju-yeon sat down on the chair with displeasure, trying to avoid all the glances that were directed at her. A group of men looked at the beauty with surprise and admiration, clearly embarrassed by her presence. The group of girls also looked at the lonely heroine with genuine interest. They were all surprised by her. People started whispering that next to them was a truly world-class star, an S-rank heroine. She rolled her eyes wearily. The man couldn't understand what kind of person would keep Hyun-ju-yeon waiting. The girl ignored his questions. Ju-yeon frowned, remembering Sodo-jun. He was the hero who had entered the gate a couple of months ago and survived. She reasoned that June must have woken up there. But then he became a suspect and was declared dead in the rift. But watching him, the girl understood that now Sodo-jun was alive and sitting in a cafe with his family. Ju-yeon remembered the guy's face. He really did make her tense up with just one word and one look. Ju knew that it took at least 5 years to reach S-rank, so June must have a special ability. And then, just a few moments later, the door to the cafe swung open again with a loud bang. Seeing that the family had finished eating, Ju-yeon hurried over to Sodo-jun, who was walking behind his sister. Seeing a certain man in front of her, the grandmother froze in place, terrified. Young followed her example. The man tensed. He frowned, peering at the man's silhouette. Jun's eyes lit up with a bright light. The yellow-haired boy was surprised by Jun's presence and asked how he had managed to crawl out of the gate. Kang Chol-woo said that from now on he would consider Jun not just an insect, but a real, tenacious cockroach. The girl wasn't very happy about Kang Chol-woo's presence either. She didn't understand how he could have ended up here. Kang Chol-woo approached his old acquaintance, smiling wickedly. Jun, however, remained calm. Then the boy walked past Kang Chol-woo, as if simply ignoring him. He looked down for a moment. Jun approached the girl, asking if she had asked to speak with him. Ju-yeon was immediately surprised. Then the girl came closer, and Kang Chol-woo was surprised that the girl was also in this cafe. Jun said he would listen to the girl if she took care of his family. Hyun Ju-yeon asked what he meant. He pointed to the grandmother and her granddaughter, saying they should simply be sent home by taxi. The old woman hid Young behind her back. The girl's eyes widened in surprise when the guy said that he would have to stay late. The boy's eyes flashed brightly with undisguised anger. Jun said he needed to repay a debt. Kang Chol-woo was already grinning like a madman. He had already raised his sword, preparing to fight the guy in front of him. The cafe sign glowed brightly. It was already late at night, but thanks to the streetlights, the roads were well lit. Hyun Ju-yeon walked Lee-eun and her grandmother to the taxi. She told them not to worry. Lee Eun-young looked at the heroine in surprise. She waved goodbye, calling the girls, "Sweet young lady." The girl smiled brightly, trying to ease the tension. A few moments later, the car finally drove away. When Jun's family had traveled far enough, the girl allowed herself to relax. Then she sighed heavily. But a nightmare was already unfolding in the cafe. A man knocked over several chairs with a single blow. It was Jun. A crowd of patrons immediately gathered behind him, watching the fight in amazement. Kang Chol-woo, who had just received a hard slap, froze for a moment. A red mark was visible on his cheek. But a moment later, the boy's eyes flashed bright red. Chol-woo said that Jun was finished now, but they were interrupted by a waitress who awkwardly apologized. She meant to say that fighting was prohibited. But Kang Chol-woo didn't want to listen to the girl. With one jerk, he pushed her away, telling her to get lost. Then the girl screamed. Some customers decided to help the waitress, while others hurried out of the building. Kang Chol-woo cried out loudly, asking if Jun really wanted to die. The man wanted to curse again, but Jun stopped him. He struck his opponent again. Jun's eyes seemed to glow for a moment. He punched Chol with all his might, knocking him to the floor. Kang Chol-woo clenched his teeth and swung. His veins were covered in inscriptions, and the capillaries in his eyes began to redden. The yellow-haired boy sat down on the floor and froze for a moment. He barely touched his face before sighing heavily. Jun, who towered over his opponent, suddenly turned to Kang Chol-woo. Jun reminded him that Kang Chol had brought him to the gate and locked him there, condemning him to death. The man lowered his gaze in response. The boy coughed up blood. Jun asked him if Chol agreed that they should talk. Chol chuckled, saying he had nothing to say to someone even his father had abandoned. He insisted that Jun's stepmother had ordered his death. But then, suddenly, Jun touched the screen of his own phone. He unlocked it. And then Jun asked Kang Chol-woo to say it again. The boy turned on the audio recording. The man, who had been kneeling this whole time, suddenly looked up at Jun. Then Kang Chol-woo chuckled nastily, saying that Jun was talking complete nonsense. The man asked what he should say again. Chul's hand burst into flame. The man repeated that Jun's mother was nothing but a dirty whore. He swung his arm, preparing to strike. The guy said that Jun should die here and now, but he stood motionless. Then the boy's pupils dilated greatly. Jun immediately took off. Kang Chol-woo was about to attack the enemy with fire, but Jun easily blocked his attack. And then, just a moment later, Chol-woo was nearly thrown into the wall again. Jun's blast of air was powerful. Kang Chol-woo was surprised, not understanding how it was possible that his fist simply bounced off. But So Do-jun wasn't about to stop there. He extended his hand forward, gathering the power of the wind element. Then Chul's body was thrown to the floor. He screamed loudly, trying to resist the flow of Jun's power. A moment later, So Do-jun rushed towards Chul, who was barely able to remain conscious. The flow of the hero's power continued to spread throughout the entire establishment for a few more seconds. The waitress, nearly in tears, said she'd call the police again. They hadn't answered her calls yet. But suddenly, a man snatched the girl's phone from her hands. The waitress immediately became frightened and recoiled. It was Ju-yeon who told the waitress not to worry. She kept saying she'd take care of everything. The girl thanked Hyun Ju-yeon with tears in her eyes, pausing for a second. She decided to listen to her. At the same time, behind them, Seo Do-jun leaned closer to Kang Chol, delivering new blows. Watching the fight, Ju-yeon couldn't understand how the B-rank hero could be so helpless next to Jun. Ju-yeon knew that even with an A rank, So Do-jun wouldn't be able to deal with Kang Chol-woo so easily. And then, moving closer to the two boys, the girl suddenly turned to So Do-jun. After a few seconds of silence, the girl said that if Jun continued, Chol would die. For a second, So Do-jun froze, frowning deeply. He turned away from the girl's face. But then the man stood up abruptly. Ju-yeon instinctively took a step back. The girl was slightly alarmed by the guy's mood. A moment later, she asked how much Jun knew about Kang Chol. The guy responded with boredom that he knew almost everything he needed to know. He just didn't understand why she needed that information. The girl sighed heavily, saying there was something important. Ju-yeon closed her eyes for a moment. The girl said that Kang Chul is the cousin of an S-rank hero named Kang Yun-pyo. But the guy just said, perplexed, that he knew about it. He asked if it was a problem. Ju-yeon realized that the guy didn't think about the consequences at all, and therefore considered him too reckless. The girl said that the selfish Kang Chol-woo acted recklessly because of Kang Yun-pyo's patronage. Ju-yeon said she didn't know about the feud between them, but Jun was wrong if he thought Kang Yun wouldn't intervene. Ju-yeon noticed the boy's smile. Her eyes widened, and she asked if Seo Do-jun wasn't afraid of the hero. But the guy only moved closer to her. Jun said he was now more worried about the girl's widespread knowledge of him. The boy was clearly angry as he looked at the girl. His frown deepened and his lips pressed into a thin line. The girl looked as if she was prepared for such a question from him. She only narrowed her eyes for a moment. The waitress hid behind the table. She wanted to remind Ju-yeon that she had promised to take care of everything. Do-jun stood face to face with the strange woman who came for him. For the first time in a long time, doubt and fear were reflected in the young man's eyes. And the girl looked at him with complete confidence, thinking about what she should say. She then apologized for the sudden meeting and said that her uncle had asked for something. She started talking about Do-jun selling magic stones to a store in Gasan and asked him to sell them to her. Without thinking, So Do-jun coldly asked how many stones she wanted. The girl waved her hand and said that she would buy everything he had. Do-jun tried to mentally calculate how much money he would receive, and then warned the girl that he had quite a lot of these stones. The stranger frowned and said that Do-jun had no idea how much money a top-ranking hero had. The poor guy was still lying on the floor, eavesdropping on the conversation. So Do-jun made his condition. He continued talking about the condition and casually mentioned that Hyun Ju-yeon would easily fulfill it. At the same time, somewhere on the other side of Seoul, someone was smashing glasses. It was that very stepmother of Do-jun's who wanted him dead the most. According to this enraged woman, Do-jun should have died when entering the new rift. Her bodyguard apologized and said that even the Hero Association thought he was dead. But the woman didn't need any excuses. She asked about the plan to kill Do-jun. But there was one more thing the bodyguard had to say. Kang Chol-woo had been beaten by Do-jun. The woman couldn't understand why Kang Chol-woo, but then a thought struck her. Do-jun knew something. Sweat broke out on the woman's face. She couldn't let her grandfather or father find out about her plan. She could have covered it up somehow, but if the media found out, the company's shares would plummet. The woman's voice was agitated. She ordered her bodyguard to control the media and silence the police. To this, the bodyguard only responded in bewilderment that they had already shut up everyone they needed to. Dojun's stepmother praised manager Yi and plopped down into the office chair. The manager reminded her that what they had done was not a one-size-fits-all solution to the problem. Therefore, the manager felt it necessary to tell the woman that Kang Chol-woo's cousin was Kang Yun-pyo. She immediately came to her senses and asked again if this was her friend Kang Yun-pei. In fact, Kang Chol-woo had a reputation as a scumbag even among hero circles. It was believed in society that his brother, Kang Yun-pyo, adored his brother, Kang Chol-woo. But in reality, Kang Chol-woo was just the one who did all the dirty work for his brother. If Kang Chol-woo were to be manipulated by the police and the media, it would be a problem for Kang Yun-pyo. Fearing that these brothers had already begun their actions, Do-jun's stepmother requested a meeting with them as soon as possible. The woman also wanted to know more about President Hwang Chang-sop's betrayal, but the manager only said that he was taking care of Do-jun's family. Hearing this, the stepmother seemed to lose her temper and ordered that Prosecutor Park be contacted so that he would pay. By this time, Seo Do-jun had been brought to the gate. There were only 37 rift zones in South Korea. Among the rift zones were 5 zones that are currently being converted into gates. The others were only accessible to heroes affiliated with the association. Now, Ju-yeon escorted Do-jun through one of the gates. In fact, Do-jun wasn't particularly thrilled with this arrangement. There was only one entrance here, but it was monitored, and now 4 more people entered before him. A-rank hero Jung In-ju approached Ju-yeon, saying that her proposal was unusual. Ju-yeon replied that she didn't see the point in going into boring, low-ranking rifts. The girl turned around and looked at the end of her group. There, at the very end of the line, trailing behind everyone else, was Seo Do-jun, a man whose abilities were far too outstanding. The girl recalled a recent conversation with him. His condition was to help him enter the Rift Zone. The girl thought that if Do-jun came to the Danger Zone to earn more money, then he was clearly out of his mind. Even without her uncle's request, she needed the hero's magic stones anyway, so she didn't object. After walking down a long corridor, the girl finally led her group into the light. Ju-yeon's friends still wouldn't stop asking about the guy trailing behind the group. Ju-yeon continued to reply that he was just an acquaintance, but her friend had already listed Do-jun as one of the girl's potential boyfriends. Hearing something about a potential partner, Ju-yeon began to deny it, saying that she was simply fulfilling his request. Ju-yeon's friend thought that she owed someone a lot of money. Their dialogue was interrupted by sharp vibrations that forced them to turn around. Ji-jun looked up, trying to figure out what was attacking them. All the heroes took up fighting stances and froze with shocked expressions on their faces. Something resembling an eagle was flying straight towards them. The creature looked quite menacing. A girl from the group screamed that it was Castrian. Apparently, everyone here was afraid of him. Ju-yeon immediately began giving orders, forcing Jinju to defend and Seonho to attack the legs. But in an instant, Do-jun rushed past the group members and rushed to attack. Ju-yeon screamed, trying to dissuade Do-jun from his strange decision to fight. Everyone present froze in shock, because for them, fighting such a monster was tantamount to suicide. Ju-yeon's friend also looked at Do-jun with confusion and fear. But none of this mattered to the young man. He had come here for stones, not sympathy. So Do-jun then gathered his fire energy into a fist and prepared to strike the monster. The monster was no longer happy about going out hunting. There was fear in its eyes. A fiery blow with enormous power hit the monster's head. After landing the blow, Do-jun decided to touch the ground with his feet and jumped down, shaking off the dust. Ju-yeon looked at this young man in complete shock, clutching her sword in her hand. Do-jun walked closer to the place where the monster's body fell. The poor creature's cheek now bore a huge dent from a fist. None of Ju-yeon's group could believe that this young man had killed the monster with one blow. But in reality, he needed to make sure the monster was dead, so Do-jun decided to finish it off. He kicked the monster sharply on the other cheek, saying that this is how he would die. A deathly silence fell over Ju-yeon's group. Everyone looked at the young man as if he were crazy. Juyeon's friend turned around and asked in fear who the hell this person was. Juyeon didn't want to think about it, so she replied with the same fear that he must just be strong. Juyeon's friend started shaking her, saying that she was not satisfied with this answer. Juyeon adjusted her glasses and replied that if it was a simple murder, then Eunhee was also capable of it. Jung In-ju continued to sing Dojun's praises for killing that monster in midair with one blow. Juyeon became increasingly confused about what was happening around her. Looking at Dojun, she wondered who this person was. Unable to find an answer, the girl turned to In-ju and said that they were changing the plan. Juyeon was going to go check out the central area. While Dojun was trying to get the magic stone out of the monster, someone approached him. Dojun, anticipating what would be asked of him, said that he did not want to share the catch with someone who was inactive. But it turned out that Juyeon had no intention of asking for a share. The girl correctly noted that his skills did not match this place and asked if he planned to go deeper. So Dojun smiled as if he had been waiting for her to ask. And then, picking up his weapon, he said that it would be interesting. Juyeon said that she knew the geography of the area, so she could guide him. A few seconds later, she rushed forward at a tremendous speed, leaving Dojun behind. Dojun remained standing in place, rooted to the spot, gathering himself to follow the girl. He got into a running stance to gain speed, and a few moments later, he was gone too. The group of 5 remained standing in disbelief. They said something about how if Juyeon was a bullet, then this guy must be a swift beam of light. One of the group members asked In-ju if they would follow the masters. It was clear that no one present could match Juyeon or Dojun in skill. They decided to wander around the area and try to find more prey. Yingzhu looked at the dead monster and thought that A-rank heroes couldn't compare to S-rank ones. Then In-ju remembered the man Juyeon had brought. He was much stronger than all of them. The realization that Dojun was stronger than Juyeon caused the girl to panic a little. At the same time, Juyeon was running through the forest as fast as she could. She turned around to see if Dojun was keeping up with her and was surprised. There was no one behind her. The girl seriously considered slowing down. But from somewhere off to the side, a familiar voice was heard asking if Juyeon could run faster. She certainly didn't expect to be overtaken, so she stumbled in surprise. Dojun pulled ahead. Juyeon couldn't believe she'd just been overtaken. She was the second fastest driver in Korea. Dojun decided he had enough of this stupid racing and stopped. The guy said that Juyeon was slower than he expected, although the girl ran as if she had made it her goal not to let him catch up with her. Juyeon realized that she had just been caught and began to deny it, while Dojun sensed the enemy approaching. From the place where they stood, there was a magnificent view of the mountain range in the center of the fault. Juyeon didn't understand where Dojun was looking, so she asked him directly. She only had to look in the same direction as him, and the girl understood. This was where the Rift Zone boss lived. It seemed Dojun didn't know about it yet. Juyeon decided to fill Dojun in on the situation and told him about the Khazarian, a monster resembling a pterodactyl. She immediately warned the young man not to think about challenging him, as at least 3 S ranks were needed to kill him. Dojun asked if it contained a magical stone of a transcendental level. After hearing a positive answer from Juyeon, he weighed the pros and cons again. The girl immediately came to her senses, realizing that this guy was about to challenge that monster. But while she was saying that she didn't bring him here to do stupid things, Dojun had already run away. Juyeon froze in place with a stunned expression on her face, not understanding what that crazy guy was planning. The girl rushed in pursuit of Dojun, shouting for him to stop this very second. After a few minutes, she finally almost caught up with him, but Dojun was still running ahead. The 2 masters moved with incredible speed. At some point, they found themselves right at the foot of the mountain. It was getting dark and cold, but the journey wasn't over yet. The girl's eyes widened and she froze in surprise. Her pupils seemed to sparkle brightly. Looking ahead in fear, Hyunjuyeon still couldn't comprehend what had happened. The corpse of a huge monster lay before her. Gripping her sword tighter, the girl took a few steps forward. Then, Ju-yeon turned her gaze to Sodo-jun, who pulled a broken sword from his backpack. The girl had always known that Kazarian possessed incredible strength. She frowned, looking at the boy. Hyun remembered Park Hae-yeol. He was a notorious S-rank assassin from Kazarian. But Ju-yeon remembered that even he had gone to Kazarian for the first time with 30 S-rank heroes. But everyone died in that battle. Then the monster destroyed every high-ranking hero. Only Park Hae-yeol managed to survive. He was seriously wounded, but afterward returned to the battlefield. The man wanted revenge, and so the next time he took with him one S-rank hero and another 200 A-rank ones. Many experienced warriors tried to defeat this monster, sacrificing their lives. And then, using green chains, the heroes began to tame the creature. They attached them to the monster's beak. But this only made Kazarian even more angry, and then he rebelled, flames emanating from his mouth. But the heroes acted decisively, knowing they wouldn't have a second chance. Screaming, they pounced on the monster. Kazarian again attempted to devour his enemies, breaking the chains on his muzzle. More than 200 people attacked the monster at once. They attacked it from afar and up close. That time, the heroes finally succeeded in defeating Kazarian. Many were injured and died during the carnage. Even despite the heavy losses, the heroes still rejoiced at their victory over the monster. Park Hae-yeol's Mega Guild suffered such losses that even after 3 years, it cannot recover. Therefore, seeing such an easy victory over the monster, the girl could not take her eyes off Sodo-jun. But suddenly the guy turned around and asked if Ju-yeon realized that she hadn't made any contribution. But Ju-yeon ignored him, thinking that if she hadn't seen it with her own eyes, she would never have believed it. She thought again of the giant Kazarian, who had a sad reputation. The thought that such a monster could fall from one blow from a man was truly terrifying. Sodo-jun didn't care about these thoughts. He simply decided to pull the magic stone out of the monster's body. The man began to examine the unusually shaped crystal. It looked as if it were wrapped in the remains of the monster's armor. The boy sighed and told Ju-yeon he no longer needed directions. He put the stone in his backpack. Then, Sodo-jun turned around, saying he would go alone now. The girl still didn't move. Ju-yeon asked if Jun would take the monster's artifacts. It turned out that Kazarian still had many valuable materials. But the guy didn't even notice. He decided to just linger for a second. He turned around and smiled. Sodo-jun said that these artifacts were not worth money. Ju-yeon was stunned by this answer. Jun continued, saying that he'd better take the other monster's stones. Waving his hand, Jun said that Ju-yeon could take Kazarian's artifacts as payment for the indicated road. The girl then turned an awkward glance to the corpse of the monster that lay nearby. Then Hyun-ju-yeon said indifferently that she didn't need these artifacts either. Sometime later, closer to sunset, a small group of people stood in the forest. They had a lot of things because there were black backpacks lying around everywhere, filled to the brim. The two girls looked at the backpacks in surprise, unsure of what to say. The man standing next to them was also dumbfounded. The guy said that Jun came with a huge backpack which was filled with magic stones. They insisted that to obtain such a quantity of stones, the entire guild would need to hunt for at least 3 days. The heroes truly couldn't believe it. Ju-yeon, however, walked away from them, crouching on the ground nearby. Hyun-ju-yeon listened attentively to their conversations, watching them from afar. One of the heroines understood that it wasn't just the quantity and quality of the stones that mattered. She, too, couldn't believe that Jun had defeated Kazarian single-handedly. The girl knew that this achievement alone would make Sodo-jun the strongest hero in Korea. Looking at the stones again, the heroine decided that it was more likely the status of the strongest hero in the world. But, suddenly turning around, the girl noticed Sodo-jun, who had come to them again with a full backpack. When the guy put the backpack on the ground, the other heroes first froze in place and then began to whisper. They insisted that people wouldn't believe them if they told them about it. Others would simply think they were crazy. One of the guys said that they couldn't tell anyone about what happened because no one would even believe it. But then, abruptly rising from her seat, Hyun-ju-yeon walked forward. the setting sun only faintly illuminating her. The girl approached Seo Do-jun and then began to mutter something discontentedly. The rest of the group listened. Someone said they were probably flirting with each other. The heroine replied that she should have noticed it long ago. They whispered that June looked like Ju-yeon's equal and that they looked good together. Others said that at first glance, they looked like a couple. But suddenly, Ju-yeon's friend cleared her throat, realizing that it was strange to call this flirting. After taking a closer look, she decided that So-jun was being careless towards Ju-yeon, and it was not appropriate to speak to her in such a tone. But her thoughts stopped when So-do-jun simply handed the backpack with stones into Ju-yeon's hands. Surprised, Hyun-ju-yeon remained where she was, but So-do-jun quickly turned and left. The group froze for a moment. The girl ran up to her friend and asked if Hyun-ju-yeon had just left without saying goodbye. Then the heroine asked what they should do with these backpacks, since June simply decided to leave them. Ju-yeon decided to tell them about her conversation with June. She warned him that if word got out about Kazarian's murder, he would gain fame. But then So-do-jun replied that he didn't need fame, and so he asked to leave the stones with Hyun-ju-yeon. Sighing in surprise, the heroine asked with displeasure who this man was. Hyun-ju-yeon turned away. The girl's gaze seemed to dim, as if she were focused solely on her own thoughts. Then the girl couldn't hide her embarrassment. Awkwardly looking away, she too wondered what kind of person June was. The bright sun illuminated the tall buildings of Seoul. It was already late afternoon, and the streets were bustling with life. The building with its dark roof was illuminated by bright rays of sunlight. Next to it stood another small outbuilding. A certain man in that building was trying his best to punch a punching bag. He wasn't feeling sorry for himself at all. The blue-haired man was endlessly practicing his punches, his eyes flashing with anger. And then, at some point, due to his blow, the punching bag simply burst into several pieces. Park Hae-yeol frowned deeply as he stared at the torn red fabric. Puck cursed and said he was in terrible shape. He was an S-rank hero, a member of the Hero Association. An assistant approached him and assured him that the frog, which crawls slowly, can jump far. The man said that the more Pak found resilience in difficult times, the more his reputation would grow. Park Hae-yeol said that this way he could strike back at the scoundrels who looked down on him. The assistant exclaimed that when the time came, everyone would prostrate themselves before the guildmaster. He chuckled. The guy said that if the conversation turns to how to defeat Kazarian, then Park Hae-yeol will be unmatched. The aide said that Pak would go down in history as the hero who defeated Kazarian with the least number of men. He insisted that the Hero Association would most likely even award Pak exclusive rights. Then the man laughed, finally coming to his senses. He said that he really did know more about Kazarian than anyone else. Park Hae-yeol said that the guild has shrunk significantly compared to how many there were 3 years ago. The chief said that he was still the only one who could definitely kill this bird. The assistant, smiling nastily, said that no one except the master was capable of such a thing. Then a ringing laugh was heard from their building, and after a while, the sun's rays began to dim over the house. A man held a photograph of So-do-jun tightly in his hands. Next to it was written all the information about him. Kang Yoon-pyo, Kang Chol-woo's cousin, mentioned Seo Do-jun's name and asked if he was the one who did this. The assistant leaned over, saying that several months ago, Kang Chol-woo tried to kill him by throwing him through the gate. Kang Yoon-pyo said that So Do-jun not only survived there, but was also able to awaken. The assistant said the client was Hong Hee-ju. Kang asked why the chaebol would chase after the boy. He replied that Seo Do-jun was the illegitimate son of the T-group president who was thrown out of the house. Kang Yoon-pye then chuckled, saying that it seemed like the chaebol family didn't value their offspring very much. Getting up from the sofa, the man asked how much Chol-woo was paid for the work he had done. The assistant replied that the final price was 3 billion. Kang Yoon-pyo was surprised. Picking up a golf club, Khan asked if the idiot had really screwed up after all. The assistant said he heard that Chol-woo's entire body was covered in burns. He was completely blind and was almost dying. Kang Yoon-pyo then sarcastically responded to the man that So Do-jun was so cruel. The man then decided to play golf at home, hitting the ball into the far hole. Licking his lips, Kang Yun-pyo thought that if he were Seo Do-jun, he would have torn out Chol's limbs and crushed his skull. And then the man tried to put the ball in the hole again. The assistant wanted to add details to the story. The man said there were rumors that Hyun-ju-yoon had helped Seo Do-jun. Kang Yun-pyo's hand twitched. And then the ball rolled past its target. The man clearly wasn't expecting such information. Throwing down the club, Kang asked why Ju-yeon was helping June and what kind of relationship they had. The assistant replied that he could not judge this, but thanks to Zoo's testimony, the case was hushed up. And then Khan pulled his assistant by the collar, shouting that he had to find out what the relationship was between them. Khan said that if there was no relationship, then there was an agreement. He rushed to the door, saying he would find out everything. Looking down, Kang Yun-pyo frowned deeply, trying to contain his anger. He clenched his teeth tighter. Then the man broke the golf club with one easy movement. The veins in his hand bulged. And then, with an exasperated sigh, Kang Yun-pyo threw the stick away, breaking it in two. Kang Yun-pyo thought that Hong Hee-ju would soon come to him to hire him to do what Chol-woo couldn't do. Then the man let out an irritated sigh, saying that, in principle, he could wait. The man licked his lips and thought that since she was a chaebol, she must have a lot of money. Sometime later, it was already deep night. Only lanterns and the moon illuminated the way for the residents of Seoul. At the same time, Seo Do-jun was slowly walking home after hunting, his hands in his pockets. The boy opened his eyes and shook his head. He thought that hunting in the rift was indeed much more effective than in the gate. June decided that he would need Hyun-ju-yeon to get past the security. He remembered her words. Ju had said that if So sold the stones, the media would be constantly pestering June. So she offered to keep them for herself. The girl said that if Seo Do-jun's goal was fame, she wouldn't stop him. She asked him about his decision. But instead of answering, the man simply decided to give her the entire backpack of magic stones. She was surprised. The guy grinned and realized that he would have to find another way to get into the rift zone. But first, the guy still wanted to relax in the new house prepared by Hwang Chang-seop. Speeding up, within a few minutes, Seo Do-jun was finally able to find himself in his new home. But as soon as he looked down, the man immediately tensed. June frowned deeply, and his eyes flashed angrily. Suddenly, the man noticed too many pairs of extra shoes. They were men's office shoes. Upon entering the house, Seo Do-jun immediately heard Lee Eun-young's loud cry. She called out loudly for her brother. Eun-young sat next to her grandmother on the sofa. A crowd of men in suits crowded around them. Only one guy stood out. It was a blond man dressed in very simple clothes. He looked up at Seo Do-jun with a tired expression. The girl threw herself into her brother's arms. June ignored her, asking who these people were. The blond man identified himself as Prosecutor Park Chul-young. He asked if June knew Hwang Jong-seop. Lee Eun-young hid behind her brother. Seo Do-ya-jun tensed, his eyes wide in surprise. The prosecutor said June was arrested for assisting Hwang Jong-seop in illegal loan sharking operations with high interest rates. The weather was fine outside, but the people inside the prosecutor's office building didn't see it. Seo Do-jun sat chained to a wooden chair in the interrogation room. The young man kept looking around, waiting for the investigator to come in. Footsteps and words were heard from the corridor that Hwang Jong-seop and Seo Do-jun were assisting the investigation. The investigator thanked someone on the phone because his daughter was currently studying abroad. He asked the person on the line to convey his gratitude to Director Hong. The investigator looked at the man in the interrogation room and continued talking on the phone. He said he took this position only to remove this garbage from the streets. Someone angrily and sharply threw a stack of forms on the table. It was that same investigator. Now he sat before Do-jun and promised to lock him up for 10 years. Holding one of the forms up in front of Do-jun's face, he informed him that Hwang Jong-seop had already reported him. The young man, of course, was not pleased. His gaze darkened. Having heard no response from the accused, the investigator lost his temper and started shouting. But suddenly, Do-jun's calm voice was heard. He asked if Hong Hee-ju was involved in all of this. The investigator, who seemed stunned for a moment, came to his senses and asked who they were talking about. Judging by the mood, Han Jong-sup's gang had been completely dismantled. But Do-jun didn't protest and agreed to pass peacefully and quietly. The investigator didn't understand this, just as he couldn't understand where Do-jun got such arrogance from. Then the investigator's face twisted, and he asked if Do-jun thought the Korean prosecutor's office was a joke. The man promised that the young man would be finished, but Do-jun only looked at him with a murderous gaze. His look alone scared the investigator to death. The man stepped back a couple of meters with an expression of genuine fear on his face. After some time, the investigator clenched his teeth and hissed as if he was angry. And then he completely lost his temper, raising his hand to slap Do-jun. But the slap didn't work. Someone interrupted their conversation by entering the interrogation room. It was a man in a suit who urgently needed the opinion of Prosecutor Park. The prosecutor stepped away from his work for a few minutes, and then a cry was heard in the corridor. Prosecutor Park was holding some documents in his hands and could not figure out what had happened. The document stated that a hero-level scanner had recognized Do-jun as an ordinary human. This baffled the prosecutor. His assistant himself could not believe it, but assumed that the information about his awakening was false. But the prosecutor knew for sure that the information the corporation gave him could not be false. At the same time, the unsuspecting Do-jun was still sitting in the interrogation room and thinking about something. He was angry about the nepotism and bribery in the prosecutor's office, and now he understood why prosecutors were called mongrels. The only thing he wanted now was to take Grandma and Eun-young and go away as far as possible. Suddenly, Ju-yeon entered the interrogation room. From the doorway, she asked him what he was doing there. And only then did it dawn on her that it was that very Do-jun sitting in front of her. The girl looked surprised. Do-jun, with a gloomy face, replied that he had no idea why he was here. The girl asked him not to make stupid decisions, as using force would only make things worse. Do-jun asked if she was trying to help him. The girl didn't give a clear answer. She diverted the topic by saying that she knew he had done nothing wrong and that she was sorry that an innocent man was being tried. So Do-jun was delighted by Ju-yeon's kindness. It could work to his advantage. The girl said that the Hero Association would conduct its own investigation, which would take into account the actions of the unlicensed hero in the recent rift in Mapo. But none of this interested Do-jun. He immediately asked the question that had been bothering him most. What had happened to his family? Ju-yeon was not happy with this question and asked why she would want to spy on his family. But since she was here, she had some information. Do-jun understood this. Ju-yeon's expression made it clear that she was definitely avoiding the topic and didn't want to talk about it. The girl turned around and was about to leave, throwing out a last remark that his family was safe. Do-jun smiled and promised to repay the debt. He didn't smile often, so he was genuinely happy now. Ju-yeon asked him to hold on a little longer until she sorted out the matter. Hyun Ju-yeon decided that there was no need to prove Do-jun's innocence through standard channels. She chose to expose Park Chol-young's bribery in exchange for his issuing illegal sentences, which led to his dismissal. However, he didn't escape charges of heroic work without a license. He got off with a suspended sentence thanks to Ju-yeon's defense. The radio in the car was blaring about some kind of unseen monster from Britain that was now attacking civilians. Do-jun said the monster was Macassian. Ju-yeon was shocked by such accuracy. The girl behind the wheel turned to Do-jun, asking how he knew about this creature. After all, it was completely new. But this young man knew much more than the organization. Monster names weren't made up at random. The mana stones contained not only energy, but also information. Analysis of this information revealed the names of the monsters, along with other data. The modern Earth analyzed everything with the help of science. But in the fallen world, this was achieved with magic. So, as long as the same monsters appear in this world as in the fallen world, Do-jun will already know most of them by name, classification, and skills. So Do-jun didn't dare explain all this to Ju-yeon. He only gave advice on how to deal with the monster. Then he began to talk about the properties of the red ant's poison and how deadly this poison is for monsters. Ju-yeon was silent for a moment, as if she couldn't find what to say. And then she abruptly asked who Do-jun really was. The young man didn't want to answer this question. He couldn't reveal his identity now. The car sped down the highway. There were two people in it. One was deep in thought, the other was completely confused. Time dragged on for an unusually long time, and Ju-yeon was still waiting for some kind of answer. But there was no answer. This made her ask the young man again if he was listening to her. Suddenly, Do-jun abruptly changed the topic of conversation and coldly asked what would happen if he killed Hong Hee-ju. At that moment, his eyes began to glow with anger again. His intention seemed quite real. Meanwhile, somewhere on the other side of Seoul, Hong Hee-ju sat and bit her nails. The woman looked as if she had just seen a ghost. Her loyal manager, I, stood before her with yet another report. This had become a tradition in recent days. Hearing the new report, the woman sank into even greater fear. Nothing had changed for the better. She couldn't understand why Hyun Ju-yeon was covering for Do-jun like that. The manager hastened to report that it is not yet clear what kind of relationship he has with Do-jun and how they met. Hee-ju had no idea what was happening or how she had gotten to this point. All she could do was live in fear. She also couldn't believe that Do-jun wasn't a hero. Everyone was so sure he'd awakened. The manager suggested that Do-jun had some ability to fool the scanner. This answer certainly did not satisfy the poor, already angry and frightened woman. She jumped up from her seat and shouted at the manager to contact Kang Yu-pei and offer him 30 billion won. But this Kang Yu-pei turned out to be quite a character. He didn't consider 30 billion a lot of money and refused. The second manager intervened in the conversation, asking if this was too much. In Hong Hee-ju's opinion, this big shot was the only way out, so he knew his worth. And Hyun Ju-yeon decided to intervene. By accepting the offer, Kang Yu-pei would have to face another S rank. His bodyguard said that Han Ju-yeon is definitely a dangerous opponent. In response to this, Director Kang slammed his shoe on the table very loudly and forcefully. The manager realized that his boss was in a bad mood, and that he himself had just said something stupid. Kang Yu-pei asked if the manager understood that not all S ranks were created equal. He also promised to take down someone like Ju-yeon in 20 minutes. The manager, in fear, began to agree with the boss's words. Having delivered such a tirade, the boss twisted his face into a terrible smile and asked what the organization had said. The organization asked to convey that it cannot increase payments due to events in Britain. Nevertheless, the association has publicly stated that it is carefully selecting the heroes it will send to address the problem. Boss Kan thought that it would now be difficult to say that the payment was too low and get out of the mission, so he asked when they were leaving. A joint transfer with the Japanese heroes was planned. Boss Kan was just planning to meet Takeshi. Macassian was a new monster whose weakness had yet to be discovered. Or rather, almost no one. But Director Kang only thought that he would become much more influential once he dealt with this new monster. Desperate battles with monsters took place in Britain. The common people, who found themselves victims, fled headlong from the huge monster that was chasing them. High-level heroes were summoned to fight these new monsters. But even the squads of professional heroes were irritated by the power of this monster. The huge monster attacked with its mouth open and one of its paws raised to strike. The mantis's leg cut through the air currents with terrifying speed. The next second, the monster's attack landed right in the middle of the group. The heroes scattered. And then they took heart and rushed into the attack. After all, there were more of them. The 5 heroes attacked the huge monster as if they no longer feared death. Some of them even used strange magical powers, gathering energy for a new attack. After several minutes of fierce fighting, the blows finally reached the monster. The monster's eyes still glowed with living lights, but the monster fell to the ground, creating numerous cracks in the asphalt beneath it. The monster's head was cut off by a squad of heroes and thrown aside. The heroes apparently expended too much energy on fighting as they all looked exhausted. The white-haired girl seemed to hear some more strange sounds and turned around. To everyone's surprise, there was another ferocious monster at the end of the street. The heroine, faced with such a sight immediately after the battle, panicked. She didn't even try to fight off the monster's new attack. Her face darkened. She had to save herself. The rain did not stop, and lightning continued to strike the same place every now and then. Britain's heroes were doing their best to stop the monsters from advancing any further, but they still lacked sufficient information about the enemy. Cambridge's front line had fallen. The monsters continued their advance, moving ever deeper into Britain. But this time, there was something strange about them. The monster's eyes still glowed. But the next moment, the sparkle in his eyes simply died, as if something had neutralized him. The second enraged monster assessed what was happening and raised his head to the sky. The monsters fell one after another, even without a fight. It was as if something invisible had struck all their vital organs. A black helicopter flew over the mountains made up of monster bodies. The team of heroes on the helicopter were none other than Team Juyun. Seeing the monsters fall dead, everyone began to thank Juyun for the advice about the red fire ant extract. Yupei could not understand how this girl was so knowledgeable. Juyun quickly put on a cheerful expression and ordered the team to finish this quickly. The next moment, a squad of heroes from Korea rushed into battle with the no longer dangerous monsters. Juyun drew her sword and was going to kill as many monsters as she could. After some time, the team of heroes had to return back to their homeland. A crowd of journalists was already waiting for them at the airport, excitedly discussing their rescue of Britain. Onlookers couldn't believe how many reporters had come. The two men talked about Juyun's fame and how she had saved Britain. It was Juyun who found Macassian's weakness. There were rumors that the British royal family was going to knight this girl. Everyone fell silent, and the team of heroes who had flown with Juyun appeared at the threshold of the terminal. The girl walked at the head of the entire team and was stunned by the fact that she would have to answer so many reporters. One annoying reporter asked how Juyun found Macassian's weakness. Yupei was also interviewed extensively. In particular, he was interviewed about how he killed the most Macassians. The group of heroes was photographed from every angle and broadcast on the news. After a long mission, it was torture. The news also said that the key to hunting these monsters was the distribution of red ant extract. Cho Do-jun watched the news broadcast from a large tower in the city center. He was either smiling or maintaining a neutral expression. But the next moment, a rather familiar face, Kang Yu-pei, appeared on the screen. And So Do-jun's eyes immediately lit up with an unprecedented hatred for this man from the TV. A certain cafe was crowded with people. Some were working, while others were discussing something among themselves. One of the visitors gave his friend several bags that were filled to the brim. Cho Do-jun looked at the gift in surprise, then asked again. He was holding a small mug. Juyun began pointing to the bags and saying where the gift was for Eunyeon and where it was for his grandmother. There was a gift for So Do-jun, too. He immediately decided to check it out. Ju, however, said it would be better to do it at home. Looking at the gift, So Do-jun said it was some kind of expensive suit. It was bright gold. Juyun said that Jun could consider this a gesture of gratitude, since, thanks to him, she became a heroine. Ju said that if Jun wanted, she could buy him a car. So Do replied that Hyun had helped him too. Juyun asked if Jun would answer the question about how he knew about Macassian's weakness. Jun said he didn't have to answer that. The girl sighed heavily in response. Juyun then asked what So Do-jun plans to do next. The girl understood that if Jun was targeting Hong-hee or Kang-yu, the situation could get out of control, and she would be obliged to prevent it. Clearly not expecting to hear from Jun that he wanted to create peace throughout the world, the girl began to wait for an answer. But in the end, the guy just casually said that he wanted to buy a house first. The girl asked in surprise if the guy was really renting a place to live now. But before the eyes of another man, there were only tall palm trees and the night sky. Beautiful girls in swimsuits were having fun all around. They were playing with a ball in the pool, chatting and laughing. Kang Yoon-pyo stood in the pool, embraced by two girls. He closed his eyes wearily for a moment. He thought about Hyun Ju-yeon, deciding that she had become different, even if only slightly. Kang Yoon-pei recalled that Ju-yeon knew about Macassian's weaknesses, but she didn't even say a word about where they came from. Then the guy remembered their recent conversation. Kang asked Juyeon what kind of relationship she had with So Do-jun. The guy said she only exposed the prosecutor to get Jun out of jail. He also recalled that she was with Jun when Chul was beaten. Juyeon replied that Chul had asked for it himself, since he had thrown Jun into the gate and had even struck first. Kang Yoon-pyo chuckled and said that Chul was already doing stupid things for pennies, so he wouldn't be surprised if he died. Kang said that after all, Chul is his brother, so he has a reason to take revenge on Seo Do-jun. In response, the girl cast a tense glance at Kang Yoon-pyo. She only frowned slightly. The man's eyes glowed bright red as he watched Juyeon's reaction intently. But suddenly the girl turned away, saying that he could do whatever he wanted because it was none of her business. The guy was surprised, realizing that in fact, Juyeon was not that close to So Do-jun. The girl said, adjusting her sleep mask, that there was no need for her to interfere with this. Now, looking at his drink, the man couldn't stop replaying her words in his head. Kang Yoon-pyo knew So Do-jun was probably hiding something. He tensed for a moment. Meanwhile, a new rift recently opened in England. A wave of monsters devastated the Lincolnshire region. The UK Heroes Association scrambled to secure more stones and sent heroes into the rift. The man said that if they had fire ant extract, even they, with D rank, could kill the Macasians. Another man agreed, saying that if they had stopped that wave at the very beginning, there would have been more rocks. The rifts from which the wave had already burst could not be turned into gates. The heroes said that it was very scary not to know what kind of monster would emerge, because entire countries had already been wiped out. One guy thought he heard someone coming out. Another suggested it might be an expeditionary force. But considering it too early, the heroes continued their fast. They figured the Mana Stone hunters would arrive soon. But then, suddenly, someone actually began to emerge from the rift, tearing apart space. Only then did the man turn around in horror, looking at the rift. His eyes widened. The other hero had exactly the same reaction. He froze in place, not daring to move out of fear. Something resembling a man came out to them. Deep scars spread across its face, and its body seemed made of iron. The monster's eyes glowed purple, and its skin took on a pink tint. Energy simmered around it. The man exclaimed that this was clearly not a hero, and that they needed to contact headquarters immediately. The monster's hand was greenish. He extended it forward, creating a strange circle in the air. Then, many more similar green circles appeared in the air, surrounding the two heroes. And then the men rose up, lifted into the air. The monster moved on, ignoring their screams. One of the heroes decided to use a weapon. Cursing loudly, the man swung with all his might. The two men were still at the monster's mercy. Trying to catch up, the boy threw 3 knives at the monster. But, of course, the monster easily repelled the attack. He was dressed in a tattered coat and trousers. The guy said that these heroes were just trash. His long black hair began to flutter in the wind. Then the man suddenly clenched his fist, causing his magic circle to suddenly break. A second later, the heroes began to cough up blood and scream in pain that suddenly pierced their bodies. A few moments later, the man extended his hand forward. His nails resembled animal claws. Then the man's fingers seemed to sparkle, and purple particles of mana began to appear around it. A telephone began to appear before the monster's eyes. It seemed as if the monster was creating the gadget in mid-air. He noticed the percentage written on the screen. It was 19.26. The monster whispered that 10 years had passed in this world's time, but it still hadn't reached even 20%. The monster asked if this was really a failure, even after all he had gone through to create the spatial rifts. But suddenly, the body lying behind the monster turned to him. The man asked what it was. The monster chuckled and said that he had things to do before raising his mana concentration. And in just a moment, the hero's body was dismembered into several pieces. Blood spattered around him. The monster chuckled, saying that he should get rid of the pathetic bugs first.